Story 1. It was the first late-night bus ride I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I was working a closing shift at a local grocery store on the edge of town. Most nights I managed to catch a ride with a coworker, but that night his car wouldn't start. That left me walking a little over a mile to the nearest transit center in the freezing cold to catch the absolute last bus of the night. It was around 11:45 p.m., and the streets were completely dead. The kind of dead where you can hear the hum of the streetlights and the crunch of your own footsteps echoing off the closed storefronts. I kept my head down, burying my face in my scarf, just trying to block out the biting wind. The walk felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed to stretch across the pavement, and every alleyway looked like a black hole. There is something deeply unsettling about being the only person outside in a city that usually never sleeps. By the time I finally saw the dull yellow glow of the bus stop shelter ahead, my hands were entirely numb. I stepped under the plexiglass roof, shivering, and checked the digital transit sign. It said the final bus was due in 12 minutes. Those 12 minutes felt like an eternity. I paced back and forth under the dim light, rubbing my hands together. A few cars passed by, their headlights sweeping over me before disappearing into the dark. But mostly it was just me and the oppressive silence of the empty road. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling that strange, irrational itch at the back of my neck. It was that feeling you get when you think someone is standing right behind you, but every time I turned around, there was nothing but empty sidewalk and dead leaves blowing across the concrete. Finally, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine broke through the quiet. The bus pulled up, its brakes squealing loudly in the still night air. The doors folded open with a sharp hiss. I stepped up into the warm, brightly lit interior, instantly relieved to be out of the cold. I flashed my transit pass to the driver. He was an older man with gray hair slumped in his seat. He barely even looked at me, just gave a tired nod. I glanced down the length of the bus. It was completely empty. Not a single other passenger was on board. I made my way down the narrow aisle, steadying myself on the handrails as the bus lurched forward and pulled back onto the road. The interior smelled like stale air conditioning, old vinyl, and faint floor cleaner. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a low, constant buzz. I decided to walk all the way to the very back. It was a habit of mine to keep my back to the wall. I sat down in the corner seat of the back row, right next to the window. I let out a long breath, resting my head against the cool glass, just watching the dark shapes of the neighborhood roll by. For the first 10 minutes, everything was perfectly normal. The bus rattled and shook over potholes, the engine grinding loudly whenever we hit an incline. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the rhythmic motion lull me into a relaxed state. The floor heater was blasting warm air, thawing out my freezing legs. I was just so exhausted, ready to get back to my apartment and collapse into bed. The route was a long one, winding through several quiet residential areas before it would eventually drop me off 2 blocks from my building. We stopped at a few red lights, but the doors never opened. Nobody was out at this hour waiting for a ride. We just sat there idling in the empty intersections before moving on. It was during one of these long stretches between stops that I noticed the first strange thing. The air inside the bus suddenly felt different. The blast of warm air from the floor heater seemed to vanish, replaced by a sudden, sharp chill that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I opened my eyes and looked around. The bus was still completely empty. The driver was just a dark silhouette at the very front, separated from me by 30 feet of empty plastic seats. I pulled my jacket a little tighter around myself, figuring the heating system had just shut off or malfunctioned. But then I heard a sound. It was incredibly faint, barely audible over the rumble of the engine. It sounded like the quiet rustle of heavy fabric, like someone shifting their weight in a winter coat. I sat perfectly still, my eyes darting toward the front of the bus. I expected to see the driver moving around, but he was perfectly still, both hands firmly on the steering wheel. The sound hadn't come from the front anyway. It sounded like it came from right in front of me, or rather, the row immediately ahead of mine. I stared at the back of the tall, gray plastic seat in front of my knees. You couldn't see over the tops of these seats unless you were standing up. For a second, a spike of genuine panic hit my chest. Did someone get on when my eyes were closed? No, that was impossible. I would have heard the loud hiss of the doors opening. I would have felt the cold air rush in from the street. Besides, the driver hadn't stopped anywhere. I told myself it was just the bus settling, or maybe a loose piece of paneling rattling as we drove. I forced myself to look back out the dark window. I tried to focus on the passing streetlights, counting them as they blurred past the glass, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't fade. My senses were suddenly on high alert. Every bump in the road made me flinch. Every shadow that cast across the interior felt wrong, and then it happened again. This time it wasn't just a sound, I felt it. The seat directly in front of me shifted. It wasn't a subtle vibration from the road. It was the distinct, heavy press of weight dropping onto the plastic frame. I felt the vibration travel through the floorboards and right into the soles of my shoes. The metal frame connecting my row to the row in front gave a faint, strained creak. Someone had just sat down. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. My breath hitched in my throat. I was frozen, my back pressed hard against the corner of the bus. The silence between the roar of the engine felt thick and suffocating. I couldn't understand what was happening. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation, but there was none. I was the only person back here. I kept my eyes locked on the top edge of the seat in front of me. I expected to see the top of a head or a hand gripping the rail, but there was nothing, no movement, no silhouette breaking the line of sight under the flickering overhead lights, yet the physical presence was undeniable. The atmosphere in that specific part of the bus had grown incredibly heavy. It felt as though a dense, freezing cloud had settled right over the row ahead of me. I could almost hear the faint, shallow sound of breathing, separated from me by less than 2 feet of plastic. A strange smell drifted back toward me. It wasn't the stale bus smell anymore. It was the scent of damp earth and something old, like clothing that had been left in a wet basement for years. It made my stomach turn. The cold radiating from that seat was unnatural. It was biting right through my layers of clothing. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to scream at the driver to stop the bus, but my body completely betrayed me. The fear had locked my muscles in place. I was absolutely terrified that if I moved, whatever was sitting there would react. Slowly, with agonizing hesitation, I shifted my gaze toward the long rectangular mirror mounted above the driver's seat at the very front of the bus. It angled perfectly down the center aisle, giving the driver a clear view of all the seats. I squinted, trying to make out the reflection of the row in front of me. The lighting was poor, casting harsh shadows across the interior. I could see my own pale face in the back corner of the mirror. I looked directly at the reflection of the seat ahead of mine. It was empty. There was nobody sitting there. A wave of confusing relief washed over me. I let out a shaky breath, closing my eyes and rubbing my temples. I was losing my mind. The exhaustion, the cold, the creepy late-night atmosphere, it was all just playing tricks on my tired brain. I told myself it was just a mechanical shift in the bus's suspension, nothing supernatural, nothing sinister. I was just a tired kid on a lonely bus ride home. I convinced myself I was overreacting to absolutely nothing. I opened my eyes, determined to brush off the fear. I decided I was going to move closer to the front, just to be near the driver for the rest of the trip. I grabbed my backpack from the floor and started to slide out of my corner seat. I gripped the cold metal handrail on the back of the seat in front of me to pull myself up. As my fingers curled around the metal, my heart completely stopped. The rail was vibrating. It wasn't vibrating from the engine. It was moving with a slow, rhythmic pulse, like a chest expanding and contracting. I let go of the rail instantly, stumbling slightly into the aisle. I was now standing directly next to the seat. The seat that the mirror showed was empty. I looked down at it. My eyes widened in pure, unfiltered horror. The thick, dark blue cushion of the bus seat was completely depressed. It was pushed down deeply in the center, as if a massive, heavy person was currently sitting right there. The old vinyl fabric was stretched tight, creasing under an invisible weight. I stood there, trembling uncontrollably, staring at the empty air hovering above the indented cushion. The freezing cold in the aisle was agonizing. It felt like walking into a meat freezer. The smell of wet, rotten earth was so strong I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. As I stood there, paralyzed in the aisle, the cushion shifted. The indentation moved slightly to the left, the vinyl squeaking loudly as the invisible weight adjusted itself. The metal frame groaned in response. Something was sitting there, something I couldn't see but could feel with absolute certainty, and it had just turned toward me. I didn't think, I just ran. I scrambled down the aisle as fast as my legs could carry me, tripping over my own feet in my rush to get away. I didn't care how crazy I looked. I stumbled all the way to the front of the bus, grabbing the pole behind the driver's seat. My chest was heaving, pulling in desperate breaths of the warm air near the front heater. The driver jumped slightly, startled by my sudden appearance. He looked at me through his rearview mirror, his brow furrowed in confusion. I slammed my hand against the yellow stop request tape on the window. A loud bell chimed through the bus. Next stop, I choked out, my voice cracking entirely. Please just let me out at the next stop. The driver didn't ask questions. He just hit the brakes as we approached a dimly lit intersection miles away from my actual apartment. The doors hissed open. The cold outside air hit my face, and it felt like absolute heaven compared to the freezing dread inside that bus. I practically jumped down the steps, my feet hitting the solid pavement. I didn't look back as the doors folded shut behind me. The diesel engine roared to life, and the large bus slowly pulled away from the curb, merging back into the dark, empty street. I stood there on the corner, shivering violently, trying to slow my racing heart. I watched the red taillights of the bus slowly shrinking into the distance. As the bus passed under a bright street lamp a block away, I caught a final glimpse of the interior through the large back window. I could see the empty rows of seats illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lights, and right there in the row just ahead of where I had been sitting, I saw the dark reflection of a face pressed against the glass, looking back at me. I walked the rest of the way home in the middle of the street. I never took the last bus again. And even now, years later, whenever I ride public transit, I refuse to sit anywhere near the back. Story 2. Back in the time I was living in a creepy roadside motel, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. I was 22 years old trying to save enough money for a real apartment. In the meantime, I was temporarily living at a rundown place called the Desert Sands Motel. It was located just off Interstate 80, miles away from the main part of town. It was a depressing ground floor room at the very back corner of the long L-shaped building. The carpet was deeply stained, the wallpaper was peeling, and the air inside always felt uncomfortably hot, stagnant, and dry. The only source of cooling in the entire space was a massive, rusty air conditioning unit bolted into the wall directly under the front window. It sounded like a heavy piece of machinery grinding its gears together, vibrating the entire wall, but it only managed to blow out a weak stream of lukewarm air. Right outside my window, sitting on the concrete walkway, was an old metal folding chair. It was covered in rust and missing one of its rubber feet. It squeaked loudly against the ground whenever the wind blew against it. On a Tuesday night in early August, I found myself wide awake at 2:15 in the morning. My sleep schedule was ruined from working the night shift, so lying there with my eyes closed felt pointless. My throat felt totally dry, like I had swallowed a handful of sand. I walked over to the small bathroom sink, hopping for some cold water. What came out of the tap was warm, cloudy, and tasted strongly like copper pipes. I desperately needed something cold to drink. I suddenly remembered the ice machine. The motel's vending area was located all the way at the front of the property, right next to the main office. I grabbed the small plastic ice bucket from my desk, slipped my feet into my sneakers without bothering to tie the laces, and stepped outside. I looked down the long, empty concrete walkway. A few yellow exterior porch lights flickered badly in the distance, casting moving shadows against the peeling doors. The entire property was completely silent. There were no cars driving past on the highway at all. I started walking slowly toward the front office. My loose shoelaces tapped against the concrete. As I got closer to the front of the building, I heard a faint noise coming from the vending alcove just around the corner. It sounded exactly like someone was talking. It was a man's voice, mumbling to himself in a low, continuous tone. The rhythm of his voice was steady, almost like he was reading a book out loud in the pitch-black dark. I felt a sudden, heavy wave of hesitation wash over me. I really didn't want to run into a strange guy hanging around the vending machines at 2 in the morning. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the shadows, just listening. The mumbling just kept going. I told myself I was simply being paranoid and that it was probably just another tired guest. I took a deep breath, gripped my ice bucket tighter, and took the final few steps around the corner. The exact moment I stepped around the brick wall and into the pale light, the voice stopped. It happened completely and instantly. The sound didn't slowly fade away, and there was no gasp of surprise. It just abruptly cut off. I froze in place. I looked completely around the small enclosed space. There was a glowing soda machine leaning against one wall and a large stainless steel ice machine resting against the other. The overhead fluorescent tube light was buzzing softly. But the alcove was completely empty. There was absolutely nobody standing there. No one was hiding by the sides of the machines. I quickly looked toward the concrete stairs leading up to the second floor, but they were clear. A terrible cold chill went straight down my spine, completely cutting through the humid summer heat. My mind scrambled to find a logical explanation for what I had heard. Maybe the sound had simply carried strangely through the empty parking lot. I shook my head, trying to force the rising panic down. I slowly walked up to the metal ice machine. It was an older model machine. In order to get ice, you had to push a thick black plastic lever backward with your cup. I held my plastic bucket with both hands and reached my arms out. My hands were still about a foot away from the front of the machine. I hadn't even touched the surface yet. Suddenly, the black plastic lever pushed backward entirely on its own. It went all the way back, as if a large, invisible hand had pressed against it firmly. The internal motor inside the machine loudly roared to life. A heavy cluster of ice cubes clattered loudly down the plastic chute and smashed directly into the metal drain tray. I stumbled backward in absolute shock. The black lever snapped back into its resting position. The machine went perfectly quiet once again. I stared at the dispenser, breathing heavily through my nose. I desperately told myself it was just a mechanical malfunction. I took a cautious step forward again. I just wanted to quickly fill the bucket and run back to my room. But before I could even raise my trembling hands, the lever was aggressively pushed back again. This time it didn't snap back into place. It stayed held firmly down. The motor strained loudly, and a continuous, endless stream of ice poured out over the tray and onto the floor. I couldn't move a single muscle. I was completely paralyzed by a deep, primal fear. I felt a massive, overwhelming presence in the room, a distinct feeling that someone was standing right next to my shoulder, quietly watching me. Then the absolute most terrifying thing happened. Resting quietly on the top of the ice machine was an empty plastic cup left behind by someone else. While the ice was still loudly pouring out onto the concrete floor, the cup slowly began to slide across the flat metal surface. It moved about 3 full inches, scraping softly against the steel before stopping right at the edge. Nothing at all was touching it. It was a very deliberate, perfectly controlled movement. I dropped my plastic bucket entirely. It hit the concrete ground with a loud clatter, but I didn't care about the noise anymore. I turned around and started walking fast. I purposely didn't run because some deep part of my brain felt that if I ran, whatever was standing in that alcove would chase me. I just power walked down the dimly lit exterior corridor. Every single shadow stretched out across the concrete looked like a person hiding. The walk back felt agonizingly slow. Night air felt incredibly suffocating. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on my room door in the distance. I completely refused to look behind my shoulder. When I finally reached the back corner of the building, I violently swiped my key card with shaking hands, shoved the heavy door open, and practically fell inside the room. I slammed the wooden door shut behind me, instantly flipped the deadbolt lock, and latched the metal security chain. I stood alone in the dark room, breathing incredibly hard. I walked slowly over to my bed and sat down on the very edge of the mattress. I didn't dare turn on any of the lamps. I just sat there in complete total silence for what felt like hours, just listening to the loud humming of the broken air conditioner. Slowly, as my heart rate started to come down, I started to convince myself that my exhausted brain had simply imagined the whole terrifying thing. But then, barely audible over the loud humming noise, I heard a very distinct sound. It was the terrible, familiar squeak of old metal scraping heavily against concrete. It was coming from right outside my front window. The metal folding chair. I completely stopped breathing. I stared intently at the closed curtains. The yellow porch light shining through the thin fabric shifted slightly, exactly as if a tall, solid shadow had just moved directly in front of the window pane. I remained perfectly still on the edge of the bed, too terrified to blink. Then I heard it start up again. The mumbling, the low, continuous, rhythmic voice of a man talking quietly to himself in the dark. Only this time it wasn't echoing off the walls from down the long hallway. It was happening right on the other side of the thin glass. He was standing directly outside my room, right next to the rusted metal chair. The unsettling voice went on for several agonizing minutes. It never changed its low pitch. It was just a steady, horrible drone. I squeezed my eyes shut, too paralyzed by terror to even reach for my cell phone on the nightstand. Then I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of the metal chair loudly groaning under a heavy, shifting weight. Someone had just sat down in it. The mumbling instantly stopped. The silence returned to the room, but it felt incredibly heavy and oppressive. I waited for a violent knock on the door, but absolutely nothing happened. I didn't sleep a single second for the rest of the dark night. When the sun finally came up and the bright morning light completely filled the room, I gathered enough courage to quickly pack my bags. I unlocked my front door and slowly pulled it open. The rusted metal chair wasn't sitting in its usual spot under the window anymore. It had been dragged directly in front of my door during the night, and it was turned entirely around, perfectly facing the door handle. I walked to my car and drove away forever. Story 3. This happened during the incident at the theater exit door. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. I know how confusing that probably sounds. When I tell this story, people usually expect it to be about a home invasion or someone hiding in my attic, and I guess in a weird way it is. But the actual nightmare didn't start anywhere near my living room. It started miles away downtown, inside the cavernous, pitch-black space of an old, dying movie theater. I just didn't realize at the time that the thing hiding in the dark wasn't going to stay there. It was late November. It was the kind of cold, miserable Tuesday night where the rain feels like freezing needles and the streets completely empty out before 9 p.m. I have always been a night owl, and I had this ingrained habit of going to the late showings at the Majestic Cinema. The Majestic was one of those massive, single-screen relics from the 1950s. It had faded velvet curtains, permanently sticky floors, and a strange, musty smell that always reminded me of old library books and stale butter. I actually loved it. It was usually dead quiet, and on weeknights, I almost always had the entire place entirely to myself. That night I had gone to see a late re-release of an old thriller. I bought my ticket from a bored-looking teenager in the box office, grabbed a large soda, and headed into the main auditorium. It was enormous, slanted aisles sweeping down toward a screen that felt miles away, flanked by these creepy, dimly lit golden sconces on the walls. There were maybe 3 other people in the entire theater, all sitting far apart in the stadium seating. I chose my usual spot right in the middle, near the back. The movie was great. I got completely lost in it. You know that feeling when you're so immersed in a film that you entirely forget you're sitting in a public place? That was me for the next 2 hours. When the credits finally started rolling and the abrasive music began to play, it jarringly pulled me back to reality. The house lights flickered on, but only halfway. They always kept them dim during the credits, casting this weird, sickly yellow glow over the hundreds of empty seats. I watched the other patrons get up and shuffle out through the back doors toward the brightly lit lobby. I stayed seated. I always liked to wait until the very end of the credits. I liked the slow transition back to the real world. I watched the names scroll by until the giant screen finally snapped to black. The music cut out instantly. The sudden silence in the massive room was almost deafening. All I could hear was the low, industrial hum of the cinema's ancient heating system pushing air through the vents high above. It was peaceful for a moment, then an odd feeling washed over me. It wasn't quite fear yet, just a subtle, nagging awareness of my own isolation. I was completely alone in a dark room built for 600 people. I grabbed my empty cup, stood up, and stretched my legs. My knees popped loudly in the quiet. Instead of walking up the slanted aisle toward the main lobby doors at the back, I decided to use the emergency exit down by the front of the screen. I had parked my car in the back alley lot, and the side exit led straight out to it. It was a shortcut I had taken dozens of times before without a second thought. I started walking down the steep aisle. The incline was sharp, and my shoes made a soft, sticky peeling sound against the ruined carpet with every single step. I reached the bottom, crossed the wide, open gap between the front row and the giant screen, and pushed through the heavy wooden double doors that led into the exit corridor. The atmosphere changed immediately. The plush, carpeted quiet of the theater was entirely replaced by bare cinderblock walls and a cold, unforgiving concrete floor. The hallway was lit by a single, buzzing fluorescent tube that kept flickering erratically. It felt like walking into a completely different building, like a hospital, basement, or an abandoned warehouse. The air in here was freezing, entirely disconnected from the heating system of the main auditorium. I walked to the end of the short corridor and shoved my hip against the metal crash bar of the heavy fire door. It didn't move. I frowned and tried again, pushing significantly harder with both hands. The metal clanked loudly against the frame, echoing sharply down the concrete hall, but the door absolutely wouldn't give. It was completely locked from the outside. I felt a quick flash of annoyance. I stood there for a few seconds, jiggling the handle and leaning my shoulder into the metal, hoping it was just stuck on the frame. It wasn't. I sighed heavily, muttering out loud to myself about lazy employees locking up early. I turned around and started the short walk back to the double doors. I realized I would have to go back through the main auditorium, up the long aisle, and out through the front lobby like everyone else. It was just a minor inconvenience, but as I pushed back through the wooden doors into the main theater, my annoyance completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a heavy, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. The theater was pitch black. The projectionist must have shut off the half-lights while I was stuck in the exit corridor. The only light in the massive cavern of a room was the faint, bloody red glow of the exit signs mounted high above the lobby doors. It wasn't nearly enough to see by. It just cast long, distorted, terrifying shadows across the rows of empty seats. I stood at the bottom of the aisle, blinking rapidly, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the gloom. It was so dark I couldn't even see my own hands clearly. The silence felt very different now. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had physically thickened in the room. I took a deep breath, mentally told myself to stop being so paranoid, and started walking slowly up the slanted aisle. My eyes were firmly locked on the red exit sign hovering in the darkness at the very top. Then I heard a thud. I froze instantly. The sound came from directly behind me, down near the front row, exactly where I had just been standing moments ago. It wasn't a particularly loud noise, but in the absolute, crushing silence of the empty theater, it sounded like a gunshot. It was a heavy, dull impact, like a heavy bag of wet sand being dropped flat onto the carpet. I stood perfectly still, my hand blindly gripping the armrest of an empty seat to my left for balance. I strained my ears, holding my breath until my lungs began to burn. I called out into the dark, asking if someone was there, maybe an employee cleaning up. My voice sounded incredibly thin and weak, absorbed almost instantly by the massive acoustic space. I waited 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Nothing answered me, just the low, mechanical drone of the ventilation system far above. I swallowed hard, trying desperately to push down the rising panic in my chest. I told myself it was probably just an old seat folding back up, or the ancient building settling in the cold. Old buildings always make noises. I forced myself to let go of the armrest and took another deliberate step up the aisle. Then I heard a step. I froze again. The sound was distinct, unmistakable. It was a single footstep, and it came from the aisle directly behind me. maybe 30 feet down in the dark. I didn't turn around, I simply couldn't. I just stood there, completely paralyzed, my brain trying frantically to rationalize what I had just heard. It had to be an echo, just the weird acoustics of the empty room bouncing my own footstep back to me from the walls. I deliberately lifted my right foot and placed it firmly down on the carpet. A split second later, the sound echoed from behind me. But it wasn't an echo at all. The timing was entirely wrong. It was a fraction of a second too late to be a reflection of my own movement, and the quality of the sound was entirely different. My sneakers made a soft, rubbery squeak on the sticky carpet. The sound behind me was remarkably heavy, dense, and flat. It sounded exactly like someone walking completely barefoot, bringing their full, dead weight down onto the floorboards with every stride. My heart started hammering against my ribs so hard it physically hurt my chest. I took a quick, shuddering breath and took 3 fast steps up the aisle. Behind me, the sound matched my pace perfectly. 3 heavy thuds. The gap between us hadn't changed at all. Whatever it was moving exactly when I moved, purposely keeping its distance. I whipped my head around, peering down into the murky darkness below. The red exit light near the screen illuminated absolutely nothing. The aisle looked completely empty, but I knew with a primal, sickening certainty that something was standing right there in the dark, watching me. I didn't want to run. I felt like if I ran, it would trigger some sort of predator instinct and the unseen thing behind me would charge. I turned back toward the top of the aisle and started walking very fast. It was an awkward, stiff speed walk. My arms were rigid at my sides, my breathing shallow and erratic. The footsteps behind me immediately sped up. They were significantly louder now, closer. It wasn't keeping its distance anymore. It was quickly gaining on me. The panic finally broke through my fragile attempt at control. I abandoned all caution and broke into a dead sprint up the steep incline. I stumbled over my own feet, practically crawling up the last few rows in the dark, my eyes locked on the glowing red rectangle of the lobby doors. Behind me, the careful mimicking entirely vanished. The footsteps erupted into a frantic, thunderous charge. They were impossibly fast. The heavy, flat impacts tore up the aisle right on my heels. I could physically feel the vibration of the floorboards rattling up through the soles of my shoes. I could hear a horrific sound underneath the footsteps, a wet, ragged wheezing noise, like air being violently forced through a collapsed lung. It was right behind me. It was literally inches away. I felt a sudden displacement of air against the back of my neck, freezing cold and foul-smelling. I hit the wooden double doors at the top of the aisle with my shoulder, throwing my entire body weight blindly into them. They burst open with a loud crack, and I stumbled out into the bright, blinding fluorescent light of the lobby. I spun around instantly, grabbing the brass handles of the doors and pulling them shut with a violent slam. I pressed my back hard against the wood, gasping desperately for air, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I waited for the impact. I waited for whatever was on the other side to throw itself against the doors, to tear them off their hinges. But there was absolutely nothing, just complete, dead silence. Across the lobby, the teenage kid at the concession stand was staring at me, a mop frozen midair in his hands, his mouth slightly open. He looked at me like I was a complete lunatic. He nervously asked me if I was okay. I couldn't speak for a moment. I just shook my head, gripping the door handles until my knuckles turned white. Slowly, terrified of what I might see, I turned around and looked through the small, rectangular glass window set into the door. I looked down the long, steep aisle into the pitch-black theater. It was totally empty, completely still. The red exit lights cast their long shadows over the vacant seats just like before. There was absolutely nothing there. I didn't even try to explain it to the kid. I knew I couldn't form the words. I just let go of the doors, walked quickly across the lobby, and shoved my way out the front entrance into the freezing rain. I walked the long way around the building to the back alley, my car keys clutched like a weapon in my fist, checking over my shoulder every 3 seconds. I fumbled with the lock, got in my car, locked the doors immediately, and sped out of the parking lot without letting the engine warm up. I drove home in a state of sheer, numb shock. The logical part of my brain kept trying to furiously dismantle the entire experience. It was the movie. I was already primed to be scared. The weird acoustics of the empty theater had just played a trick on my ears. The side door was just jammed. It was all a massive, embarrassing overreaction fueled by a creepy atmosphere and an overactive imagination. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had almost entirely convinced myself it was all in my head. I lived alone in a small, single-story house in a very quiet suburban neighborhood. I walked inside, locked the deadbolt tight, double-checked every single window, and turned on every light in the house. I took a boiling hot shower, trying to wash the cold, clinging dampness of the theater off my skin. I put on comfortable clothes and sat in the living room for a while, watching a mind-numbing comedy show on television just to fill the quiet house with normal noise. Slowly, my erratic heart rate returned to normal. The sheer, primal terror of the movie theater aisle began to slowly fade into just a very bad memory. Around 2:30 a.m., I finally felt exhausted enough to actually sleep. I turned off the living room television, walked down the short hallway to my bedroom, and got into bed. I purposefully left the hallway light on and my bedroom door cracked open just an inch. A childish comfort, I know, but I couldn't bear the thought of total darkness just yet. I pulled the heavy blankets up and closed my eyes. The rain was still drumming lightly against my bedroom window, a steady, rhythmic sound that was actually kind of soothing. I felt my tense muscles finally begin to relax. I drifted off into a shallow, uneasy sleep. I woke up abruptly. I didn't know what time it was, but the rain had completely stopped. The house was dead quiet. I lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I felt wide awake, experiencing that sudden, jarring alertness that usually means a specific noise just woke you up. I listened carefully, nothing, just the faint hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall. I slowly turned my head and looked at the glowing digital clock on my nightstand. It was 3:15 a.m. I closed my eyes again, rolling over onto my side. I mentally told myself to go back to sleep. Then I heard it. It came from the kitchen at the very far end of the house. It was a thud. My eyes snapped open. I instantly stopped breathing. It was a heavy, dull impact. It sounded exactly like a heavy bag of wet sand being dropped onto the kitchen linoleum floor. I lay completely frozen in my bed, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs just as violently as it had hours ago in the cinema. I stared in pure horror at the sliver of light coming through my cracked bedroom door. The silence stretched out for 10 agonizing, suffocating seconds. Then another sound echoed through the house. It was coming from the living room now, moving closer to the hallway. It was a step. It wasn't a shoe, it was a heavy, flat, barefoot thud. The exact same terrifying, dead-weight sound that had chased me up the carpeted aisle of the majestic cinema. It hadn't been an echo in the theater. It hadn't been my imagination. It had been real. And whatever had been standing in the dark with me in that empty room, it hadn't stayed there. It had somehow followed me. I didn't move a single muscle. I just lay there in the dark, entirely paralyzed by a fear so absolute it felt freezing cold. I stared at the sliver of light at the door, listening to the impossible. The heavy footstep sounded again. It was in the hallway now. Another step. It was right outside my bedroom. The heavy, wet footsteps stopped just outside my cracked door. A large shadow suddenly fell across the thin beam of light on the floor, blocking it out completely. I lay there, trapped inside my own house, staring at the dark gap in the doorway, waiting for the door to slowly push open. It never did. But the shadow never moved away, either. Story 4. This happened on a cold winter night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. At the time, I was 27, and I had just driven 4 hours north of Seattle to a rental property deep in the Cascade Mountains. I needed to get away from everything for a few days. Work had been completely overwhelming, and I just needed to disconnect. The listing had promised total isolation. It was a single-story A-frame structure surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked out most of the natural light, even during the middle of the day. When I pulled up to the property that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was how silent the woods were. It wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet, it was a heavy, dead silence. The cabin itself was beautiful but very basic. There was a small living room with a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, and one bedroom at the back. It had a steep metal roof, which makes sense for places that get heavy snowfall. And most importantly, the interior ceilings were vaulted. You could look up and see the exposed wooden beams right against the underside of the roof. There was no attic. There was no crawl space above my head. Just a few inches of wood and insulation separating the inside from the outside. I unpacked my bags, putting my clothes in the small wooden dresser by the bed. Next to the stove in the living room, there was an old heavy iron fire poker hanging on a hook. I remember noticing it because it looked completely out of place next to the modern electric fireplace they had installed to replace the real one. I just brushed my hand against the cold iron, feeling a strange sense of comfort knowing a heavy object was nearby. I made myself a simple dinner, turned on one of the small reading lamps, and settled onto the couch with a book. By 8:15 p.m., the sun had completely set. Out here there were no streetlights, no passing cars, no ambient glow from a nearby town. When you looked out the windows, it was just a wall of absolute blackness. I caught myself staring at the large glass sliding door a few times, getting that weird, uncomfortable feeling that someone was standing just past the reflection, looking in. But of course, there was no one out there. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away down a dirt road. Around 9:30 p.m., the wind started picking up. I could hear it howling through the tops of the pine trees, a low, rushing sound like a distant ocean. That's when the tapping started. It was a slow, irregular clicking against the glass of the bedroom window. Tap, pause, tap, tap. At first, it didn't really bother me. I figured it was just the wind blowing a loose branch against the pane. I went back to reading my book, but the rhythm of the sound kept interrupting my focus. It felt too deliberate. I finally put my book down and walked into the dark bedroom to check on it. I cupped my hands around my eyes and pressed my face against the cold glass, peering out into the darkness. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust, but when they did, I felt a sharp drop in my stomach. There were no trees within 10 feet of that window. Not a single branch was close enough to reach the glass, even in heavy wind. The tapping had stopped the moment I entered the room. I stood there for a long time, holding my breath, just listening. I told myself it must have been a bird, or maybe just the house settling in the dropping temperatures. Your brain tries to find a logical explanation for everything because the alternative is just too terrifying. I pulled the heavy curtains tightly shut, making sure there were no gaps, and walked back out to the living room. I didn't feel like reading anymore. By 11:45 p.m., my eyes were heavy, and the sheer exhaustion of the week was finally catching up to me. I made sure the front door was dead-bolted, checked the lock on the sliding glass door twice, and turned off the living room lamp. The darkness that swallowed the cabin was immediate and absolute. I used the flashlight on my phone to guide myself back into the bedroom. The temperature inside had dropped quite a bit, so I buried myself under the heavy quilt on the bed. I lay there staring up at the dark, vaulted ceiling. I could vaguely make out the shapes of the wooden beams crossing overhead. The wind outside had died down, leaving that heavy, ringing silence once again. I was just hovering on the edge of sleep when I heard the first sound. It wasn't a tap on the glass. It was a deep, heavy thud, and it came from directly above me. My eyes shot open. I lay completely frozen, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I stared up into the pitch black, waiting. A few seconds later, there was another thud, then another. It sounded like something heavy was moving. I tried to convince myself it was a pinecone falling from a high branch, hitting the metal roof, but the sound wasn't sharp like a sudden impact. It was a dull, heavy scrape, followed by a settling weight. Then the pattern became undeniable. Step, pause, step. Someone was walking on the roof. My mind immediately started racing, trying to process how that was even possible. The roof was pitched at a steep angle, covered in smooth, slippery metal and damp from the cold night air. Whoever was up there was moving slowly, deliberately, keeping their balance with a terrifying amount of control. The sound of their boots crunching against the frost-covered metal was sickeningly loud in the quiet cabin. I listened as the heavy footsteps slowly made their way toward the front of the cabin. The wood groaned under the weight. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't step with that kind of calculated rhythm. It was a person, and they were large. I pulled the quilt up right below my eyes, gripping the fabric so tightly my knuckles ached. I could track their exact movements because of the vaulted ceiling. They were walking the ridge of the roof, moving from the living room area back toward the center of the cabin. Tears of sheer panic started to well up in my eyes. I was miles away from anyone, completely alone, with no cell service. I reached over to the nightstand, my hand trembling uncontrollably as I grabbed my phone. I illuminated the screen. No signal, not even a single bar. I was entirely cut off. The footsteps above me paused for a moment, as if the person up there was listening, trying to sense my movements inside. I shifted my weight on the mattress, but the bed springs let out a loud, high-pitched squeak. I instantly froze, violently cursing myself in my head. The silence that followed was suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for a reaction from above. The person on the roof had heard it. I knew they had. The heavy, deliberate footsteps started moving again, but this time they weren't packing the ridge. They were moving down the slope of the roof, directly toward the back of the cabin, toward the bedroom. Step, the wood above my doorway creaked. Step, they were directly over the center of my room. The sound was so loud, so intimately close, it felt like they were in the room with me. Because there was no attic, there was only about 6 inches of material separating this person's boots from the air just above my face. I could hear the faint, grating sound of gravel or dirt shifting under the heavy tread of their shoes against the metal panels. Then the footsteps stopped. They had reached the exact section of the roof positioned directly over my bed. A sickening groan of bending wood echoed through the room as they shifted their weight, settling into a firm standing position. And then nothing, total silence. I waited for them to start moving again. I waited for them to walk back toward the front or climb down or do anything at all, but they didn't move. 10 minutes passed. I didn't dare blink. My eyes were locked onto the dark ceiling right above me, completely terrified that at any second the wood would splinter and give way and this massive weight would come crashing down on top of me. I could almost picture them up there, crouching on the cold, slanted metal, staring down through the thin layers of the roof, knowing exactly where I was lying. Why weren't they moving? What were they waiting for? I suddenly remembered the heavy iron fire poker hanging by the stove in the living room. It was my only potential weapon, but to get it, I would have to get out of bed, walk across the dark bedroom, and go out into the other room. Every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to stay perfectly still. If I moved, they would hear my footsteps on the floorboards just like I heard theirs. They would know I was awake. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed faintly. Reading 2:15 a.m., they had been standing directly above me for almost an hour. My body was painfully cramped and aching from holding the same rigid position, but absolute terror kept me paralyzed. Every few minutes I would hear a very faint, subtle shift in their weight, a tiny creak of the roof panels, just enough to let me know they were still there, still waiting, still hovering right over my body in the freezing dark. I tried to rationally think of an escape plan. I could try to make a run for my car. My keys were sitting right on the kitchen counter. But to get to the car, I'd have to unlock the front door, run out into the open driveway, and get the engine started before they could react. If this person was already outside, they could easily slide down the low edge of the roof and drop right in front of me before I even made it to the driver's side door. It was just too risky. The cabin was my only physical barrier. I had to wait it out until morning. 3:30 a.m., 4:45 a.m., the psychological torture of those hours is impossible to describe. Your mind starts playing awful tricks on you. The silence becomes so loud it physically hurts your ears. I started imagining that I could hear the faint sound of deep, heavy breathing coming through the ceiling boards, even though I knew that was totally impossible. I was trapped in a starring contest with a piece of wood, knowing a predator was waiting on the other side. Around 6:15 a.m., the sky outside my window finally began to shift from pitch black to a deep, bruised purple. Dawn was coming. The ambient light slowly began to filter through the cracks in the curtains. I was exhausted, my eyes burning and my muscles violently trembling from the adrenaline crash. I hadn't heard a single sound from the roof in over 2 hours. Had they left? Did I miss the sound of them climbing down over the howling wind that had picked up again? I finally mustered the courage to move. I slowly slid my legs out from under the quilt. My feet hit the cold hardwood floor. I didn't make a sound. I crept down the short hallway into the living room, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker off its hook. The metal was freezing in my grip, but it made me feel just a fraction safer. I stood by the front window, peering through the blinds out into the dim morning light. The driveway was empty. The woods were entirely still. I didn't pack my bags. I just grabbed my car keys from the counter, unlocked the deadbolt, and sprinted out the front door toward my car. The freezing morning air hit my lungs like glass, but I didn't stop until I was inside with the doors tightly locked. I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. As I threw the car into reverse, my headlights swept across the side of the cabin, illuminating the exterior wall. I slammed on the brakes, my foot trembling against the pedal, as my eyes locked onto something that made my stomach drop all over again. The side of the house was made of smooth, overlapping wooden siding. Running right up the center of the wall, leading directly from the ground up to the lowest edge of the roof, were thick, smeared streaks of dried mud. They weren't just random smears. They were clear, wide handprints and heavy boot scrapes dug violently into the wood. Someone had climbed up the completely flat side of the cabin with their bare hands. I didn't stick around to investigate anything further. I slammed the gas pedal down and sped down the long dirt road, barely keeping the car steady on the loose gravel. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway, where the sun was fully up and other cars were on the road. I called the property owner from a gas station and told him to keep my belongings. I still think about that night constantly. I think about the terrifying amount of physical effort it would take for a grown person to climb a vertical wall and balance on a freezing, sloped metal roof in the pitch dark. But what haunts me the most isn't how they got up there. It's the fact that they never actually tried to break in. They didn't want my money and they didn't try to attack me. They just spent hours standing in the freezing cold, doing absolutely nothing. Just to make sure I knew they were there. Story 5. During the elevator voice, I was staying in a basement apartment. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. I lived in a massive, outdated apartment complex in Chicago. My unit was located entirely on the foundation level. The rent was incredibly cheap, mostly because my single window looked out at a flat concrete wall. My front door opened directly into a long, narrow corridor that led to the building's main laundry room. At the very end of that long corridor was the service elevator. Residents frequently used it when the main lobby elevators were broken. My bedroom wall actually shared a structural column with the elevator shaft. I didn't think much of it when I first signed the lease. I figured I would just occasionally hear the mechanical hum of the metal cables going up and down. But after a few weeks, I started hearing something else late at night. I would be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I would hear this heavy, dragging sound. It sounded exactly like someone slowly pulling a heavy piece of wooden furniture directly above my head. Naturally, I assumed it was just my upstairs neighbor. The dragging would eventually stop, and then a strange, dull tapping would start. It was a slow, rhythmic thud against the wood. This went on for about 2 weeks. Then one night, I came home from work around 2:15 a.m. I walked down the quiet basement corridor. As I passed the service elevator, I stopped completely in my tracks. The heavy, dragging sound was happening right then, but I wasn't inside my bedroom. I looked up at the ceiling, fully expecting the sound to be coming from the first floor. It wasn't. The sound was coming from right behind the heavy metal doors of the service elevator. It was echoing deeply down the hollow shaft. Whatever was making that horrible noise was inside the elevator car itself. I stood there in the dark hallway just listening. The dragging stopped. Then the rhythmic tapping began. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded like a physical knuckle knocking against the inside of the doors a few floors above me. I felt a cold chill hit my chest. I hurried inside my apartment and locked the deadbolt. A few days passed without any major incident. You know how you try to rationalize things to make yourself feel safe? I did a lot of that. I tried to convince myself it was just old pipes expanding in the walls, but the air in my apartment started feeling completely different. It felt much heavier, like a strange pressure building up in the room. It was a Tuesday night when everything fully escalated. I had accidentally left my work laptop in my car out in the street-level lot. I really needed it for an early meeting the next morning. I looked over at the microwave clock. It was 1:45 a.m. I groaned, put on my shoes, and walked out into the basement corridor. The single fluorescent tube near my door flickered slightly. I just wanted to ride up one floor, grab my bag, and come right back down. I pressed the call button. The hallway was completely dead silent. Usually you could hear the distant rumble of city traffic through the concrete. Tonight there was absolutely nothing, just a thick, uncomfortable silence. After a long minute, I heard the heavy cables groaning deep inside the shaft. I watched the mechanical floor indicator dial slowly spin. 4, 3, 2, 1, basement. The metal doors slid open with a loud, grinding screech. The inside was dimly lit by a single dirty bulb. It had scuffed wood paneling and a faded linoleum floor. I stepped inside the car. As I turned around, I noticed a deep crescent moon scratch on the brass metal panel beneath the buttons. I had seen it 100 times before. I reached out to press the button for the first floor, but before my finger even touched the cold metal circle, the heavy doors suddenly slammed shut. They snapped closed with a violent bang that made me jump backward in total shock. I stood there, my heart beating much faster. I hadn't pressed anything at all. None of the floor buttons were lit up. I reached out again, thinking the old electrical wiring had just glitched. Then, from the back right corner of the small elevator car, someone softly spoke. "Going up." The voice was incredibly soft. It was barely more than a whisper, but it sounded completely wrong. It didn't sound like a normal human voice. It sounded severely distorted, like someone speaking through a thick layer of water or a broken radio tuning into a dead station. It had a wet, raspy texture to it. I froze completely. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped in a metal box that was maybe 6 feet wide, and I knew for an absolute fact that I was the only person inside. I slowly turned my head, looking over my shoulder toward the back corner. There was absolutely no one there, just the scuffed wood paneling and the dirty floor. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. I turned back to the control panel and frantically started pushing the button for the first floor over and over again. The button wouldn't light up. The doors simply wouldn't open. I slammed my open palm against the emergency door open button. It was completely dead. Then I felt a slight, sickening jolt. The floor beneath my feet physically shifted. The elevator was moving. It was going up. I panicked. I grabbed the rough edges of the metal doors and tried to pull them apart with all my strength, but they were locked solid. I looked up at the mechanical indicator dial. We were passing the first floor. The needle kept smoothly moving. 2, 3. I yelled out, demanding someone to stop the car. My voice completely cracked. There was no security camera in there. There was no intercom button, just me, screaming into the stale air. The elevator passed the 4th floor. This entire building only had 6 floors. I backed myself aggressively into the corner directly opposite where I had heard the voice. I kept my eyes locked on the closed doors, clutching my car keys so hard my knuckles actually hurt. Then I distinctly heard it speak again. "Going up." This time it wasn't a question. It was a firm statement, and it was much louder. The distortion was significantly worse, grating violently against my ears like grinding metal. But the most terrifying part was the location of the sound. It didn't come from the back corner. It came from directly in front of me. It sounded exactly like something was standing mere inches from my face. I closed my eyes tightly, too terrified to even look. I felt a freezing drop in temperature inside the car. The air felt dangerously thin, like all the oxygen was being sucked right out. I could clearly hear a ragged breathing sound. The breathing overlapped perfectly with the mechanical hum of the elevator moving. It was incredibly uneven and wet. The floor indicator clicked heavily past the 6th floor. My eyes shot open in pure terror. There was no 7th floor. The roof access was just a locked stairwell, but the elevator kept climbing anyway. The metallic groans of the thick cables grew much louder. They strained violently, forcefully pulling the car into a part of the pitch-black shaft that hadn't been used in decades. The small bulb in the ceiling started to flicker rapidly. The dim yellow light pulsed, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. I saw that crescent moon scratch on the brass panel reflecting the intense strobe light. It felt like reality itself was breaking down inside this tiny space. Then the elevator jolted to a harsh, violent stop. The sudden halt threw me completely off balance. I fell hard against the wood paneling. A second later, the overhead lights completely died. I was plunged into absolute, crushing darkness. I didn't move an inch. I didn't breathe. I just sat on the cold floor of the elevator in the pitch black, listening to the strained groaning of the steel cables above me. For a very long moment, there was nothing. No wet breathing, no distorted voice, just the heavy silence of the dark shaft. Then very slowly, the metal doors began to slide open. They made a horrible, high-pitched squealing sound as they parted. I scrambled backward, desperately pressing my back against the rear wall. The doors opened completely, revealing the space outside. It wasn't a hallway, it wasn't the roof, it was just an open, cavernous void of absolute darkness. The freezing air that rolled into the elevator car smelled strongly of old rust and damp earth. It was completely pitch black out there. I couldn't see a floor or walls or a ceiling, just totally empty space. I stayed pressed against the back wall. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of the elevator, but my survival instincts kept me frozen. Every single fiber of my being told me that stepping out into that darkness would be the final mistake of my life. Suddenly, from the pitch-black void outside the open doors, a voice spoke again. "Going down." It was deafeningly loud, it was fully distorted, vibrating violently through my chest like a physical force. It wasn't a human voice anymore. It was just pure noise shaping itself into words. I lunged forward in the dark. I didn't care what was out there anymore. I threw my hands against the brass panel, blindly slamming my palms against where I knew the buttons were. I hit every single one of them in a frantic, desperate rhythm. I felt the deep crescent moon scratch painfully dig under my thumb as I smashed the basement button repeatedly. For an agonizing few seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The freezing air kept pouring into the car. I could physically feel a cold, heavy presence moving closer to the open doors. Then, the heavy metal doors screeched loudly and slammed shut. The sudden noise made me cry out. The exact moment the doors sealed shut, the small overhead bulb flickered back on. I was alone again. I collapsed onto the dirty floor, pulling my knees to my chest, shaking uncontrollably. The elevator jolted hard, and the sickening feeling of descending quickly took over my stomach. The mechanical floor indicator spun backward rapidly. It passed the 6th floor, then the 5th. I didn't move from the floor. I just sat there and watched the numbers. When it finally hit the basement level, the doors slowly opened to my familiar, flickering hallway. I scrambled out of that car so fast I scraped both my hands on the linoleum. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the hallway, fumbling nervously with my keys, practically throwing myself inside my apartment. I locked every single bolt and immediately pushed a heavy armchair against the door. Later that afternoon, I quickly packed a single duffel bag and never spent another night in that apartment. I moved out to the suburbs a month later. I live in a ground floor unit now. There are absolutely no elevators here. I tried to convince myself it was just a severe mechanical failure, a massive panic attack brought on by pure sleep deprivation, and an overactive imagination playing violent tricks on me in the dark. But sometimes, when I'm alone late at night, my cell phone will ring with a completely blank caller ID. And when I finally answer, all I hear is that exact same thick, wet, distorted breathing, accompanied by the faint, slow, grinding noise of heavy metal doors sliding open. Story 6. Around the time I snuck into a closed pool at night, I started getting strange notifications from my security camera. The weird part was, the camera wasn't even plugged in. I lived in an older apartment complex in central Arizona. It was the middle of August and the heat was absolutely relentless. The air conditioning in my unit had failed completely 3 days prior, and the property management company was taking their sweet time fixing it. I was a stressed college student, exhausted and running on barely any sleep. My apartment was situated on the second floor, with a small balcony that directly overlooked the central courtyard where the main swimming pool was located. I had a cheap wireless security camera sitting on my living room windowsill. I originally bought it to keep an eye on my front door, but the charging cable had frayed and the internal battery died over a week ago. It was sitting there useless. Yet around 2:15 a.m. my phone buzzed on my nightstand. The screen illuminated the dark bedroom. It was a motion alert notification from the camera app. I assumed it was simply a software glitch or a delayed notification. But when I swiped it open, the screen displayed pitch black. There was no image feed, just a timestamp. 2:16 a.m. I walked over to the window. The camera was sitting exactly where I had abandoned it. The power cord was hanging loose, nowhere near an outlet. It unsettled me, but my physical discomfort vastly outweighed my unease over a phone glitch. Peering down through the window blinds, I could clearly see the community pool. It was closed, obviously. The iron gates locked at 10 p.m. every night, but the bright underwater lights were left on overnight, casting a glowing blue aura across the courtyard. It looked incredibly inviting. I figured a quick swim would lower my core temperature just enough to sleep. I grabbed my towel, slipped on my swimsuit, and quietly left my apartment. The outdoor hallway was stagnant. The humid night air felt heavy in my lungs as I made my way down the concrete stairs. The entire complex was dead quiet. The only sound was the low hum of distant air conditioning units. As I approached the enclosed pool area, the strong smell of chlorine hit my nose. I paused for a cautious moment at the fence, looking around the dark courtyard to make sure nobody was watching. All the surrounding windows were dark. I reached my arm high over the top of the fence, feeling around for the metal latch. I lifted it upward, and the heavy gate clicked open. I slipped inside and gently pushed it shut behind me. The pool deck was paved with rough stone that still retained a surprising amount of heat from the blazing afternoon sun. The bright underwater lights illuminated the water in a way that made it look completely artificial, like a glowing blue gemstone set into the ground. The water itself was perfectly, flawlessly still. It looked exactly like a solid sheet of colored glass. There was something intensely peaceful about being alone in a large space that was meant for dozens of loud, splashing people. Having it entirely to myself felt like I had somehow paused time itself. I tossed my towel onto a lounge chair and walked slowly over to the shallow end. I carefully stepped down the wide concrete stairs, not wanting to make a loud splash. The water was incredibly cool. It sent an immediate wave of relief washing over my overheated body. I waded much deeper, letting the water rise past my waist and then up to my chest. I let out a long, slow breath that I didn't even realize I had been holding in. For the first 10 minutes, everything was absolutely perfect. I floated gently on my back, looking up at the dark, empty sky. I eventually flipped over and swam a few slow, relaxed laps. When you're fully underwater at night, your physical senses change dramatically. Your hearing becomes heavily muffled, picking up nothing but the rushing sound of water and the rhythmic thumping of your own pulse. It was exactly during one of these long underwater glides that I first noticed something was wrong. I was swimming smoothly near the bottom of the deep end. Through the blurry, chlorinated water, I saw a very large, incredibly dark shape move rapidly across the bottom of the pool floor. I immediately kicked hard and broke the surface, gasping for fresh air, wiping the stinging water from my eyes. I spun around in circles, treading water frantically, looking all around the concrete pool deck. I fully expected to see a security guard standing there pointing a flashlight at me, but the deck was entirely empty. The rows of lounge chairs sat perfectly undisturbed. The large patio umbrellas were folded up tightly for the night. Nothing outside the water was moving at all. I firmly decided I was not going to let a harmless shadow ruin my only chance to properly cool off. I slowly swam back toward the safety of the shallow end, making sure to keep my head completely above the water this time. The profound silence of the courtyard was suddenly feeling a little less peaceful and a lot more oppressive. I stood perfectly still in the waist-deep water, resting my crossed arms on the rough concrete edge of the pool, looking out over the empty chairs. The displaced water slowly settled back down, eventually returning to that unnatural, glass-like stillness. I stood quietly in that spot for about 15 minutes. I was ready to finally get out and head back up to my sweltering apartment. That was exactly when I saw it happen again. I was looking straight ahead at the opposite side of the pool. Right in the center of the deep end, a dark shadow suddenly appeared. But this time, it was not resting on the bottom of the pool floor. It was resting directly on the actual surface of the water. It was an incredibly deep dark hue, completely blocking out the glowing blue light trying to shine up from below. It was roughly the size of a human torso. The most terrifying part was that there was absolutely nothing above the pool to cast it. There were no overhanging trees. There were no security lights shining down. The surface of the water was completely flat and totally undisturbed. I instantly froze in place, every single muscle in my body violently locked up tight. My chest tightened painfully, making it incredibly hard to draw a normal breath. I simply stared directly at it, trying desperately to process what my eyes were forcing me to see. The dark shadow remained perfectly still for a few agonizing seconds. Then it slowly began to move. It moved forward with very clear, deliberate intention. It glided smoothly across the surface of the water, heading directly toward the side of the pool where the metal exit ladder was located. The water did not ripple even slightly as it moved. There was absolutely no sound of splashing. It was literally just a flat, black absence of light sliding effortlessly across the glowing blue surface. I desperately wanted to scream out for help, but my throat felt completely paralyzed. I was waist deep in the freezing water, standing only 20 feet away from this impossible thing. My frantic mind was racing, screaming loudly at me to run away, but my legs felt like they were firmly encased in concrete. I watched in absolute, helpless horror as the dark shadow reached the far edge of the deep end. It stopped moving right at the concrete edge. It lingered there for a moment, resting exactly where the metal ladder descended into the deep water. For a brief, hopeful second, I genuinely thought it was going to simply disappear. I prayed it was just some bizarre, unexplained optical illusion. I started to carefully back away toward the shallow exit steps behind me, trying my hardest not to make a splash. As I took my very first slow step backward, the shadow violently changed its behavior. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the flat darkness began to actively peel itself upward. It was exactly as if a two-dimensional stain was forcefully pulling itself into a three-dimensional object. The thick black mass steadily rose up from the surface of the water, stretching tall against the tiled wall of the pool deck. It possessed absolutely no defining human features. Simply a towering, impossibly dark silhouette standing right at the edge of the pool. It stood easily over 7 feet tall. The bright ambient glow emanating from the underwater lights seemed to physically bend entirely around it. It was a complete void. Pure survival-driven adrenaline flooded my system. I spun around and practically launched my entire body forward out of the shallow water. I thrashed violently through the resisting water, frantically scrambling up the concrete exit steps. I sprinted blindly toward the heavy iron gate, forcefully shoved it open, and ran for my life. I ran frantically through the dark courtyard, my bare feet slapping loudly against the concrete walkways. I took the outdoor stairs 2 at a time, flying up to the safety of the second floor. I reached my front door, shoved it open, and slammed the heavy wood entirely shut behind me. I instantly engaged the deadbolt in the sliding chain lock. I sat trembling in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the deafening silence of my empty apartment. When the morning sun finally began to rise, casting a weak gray light through my living room window blinds, I forced myself to stand up. I walked slowly over to the window to completely close the plastic blinds, but right before my hand reached the wand, my eyes fell on the windowsill. The broken white security camera was exactly where I left it. The frayed power cord was still dangling uselessly. But the small green indicator light on the front of the camera lens was glowing extremely bright and completely steady. It was turned fully on, and its small black lens wasn't pointing outside anymore. It had physically turned around. It was pointing directly at me. Story 7. This happened while I was house-sitting for my aunt near the warehouse aisle. The creaking floors didn't bother me until they started following me. My aunt managed a massive commercial storage facility right on the edge of the city. It was an old, heavy industrial building that had been converted to hold overflow inventory for local businesses. She lived in a small, renovated loft apartment that was built directly over the main office, looking out over the entire warehouse floor through a large glass window. She was visiting family out of state for 2 weeks, so she asked me to stay at her place, keep an eye on things, and do some late-night inventory counting for extra cash. I was a broke college student at the time, so I agreed without hesitation. I figured it would be a very easy job, just me, a clipboard, and thousands of dusty cardboard boxes. The warehouse itself was extremely intimidating to be in alone. It was roughly the size of 2 football fields, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into the dark shadows. There were 30 long aisles in total, separated by towering metal racks that reached almost all the way to the roof. The racks were completely packed with wooden pallets, heavy machinery parts, and shrink-wrapped crates. Because the building was so old, it constantly made strange noises. The metal roof would pop and groan as the temperature dropped outside. The massive air conditioning units would hum and rattle unpredictably. I was used to normal building sounds, so the creaking and settling didn't really bother me at first. I actually kind of liked the complete isolation. It was peaceful in a weird, lonely way. The lighting in the warehouse was entirely controlled by motion sensors to save on electricity. This meant that the building was almost entirely pitch black at night, except for the specific aisle you were currently standing in. When you walked into a new section, the overhead fluorescent lights would flicker to life with a loud, buzzing click, but they were on a very short timer. If you stood still for more than 3 minutes to count a shelf, the lights would suddenly snap off, plunging you into complete darkness without any warning. You had to wave your arms around or take a few large steps to get them to turn back on. It was annoying, but I slowly got used to it over the first few days. It was a cold Tuesday night when things started to feel wrong. The time was about 11:15 p.m. I had just finished my dinner up in the warm loft and decided to head down to the main floor to finish counting a large section of electronics. I grabbed my clipboard, a small flashlight, and my heavy winter coat because the warehouse was poorly heated and freezing at night. I walked down the metal stairs, my boots clanking loudly against the open steps. The sound echoed heavily through the massive, empty building. I grabbed a small, metal rolling cart from the front office to hold my paperwork and a few loose boxes. The cart I grabbed had one bad wheel that squeaked loudly with every single rotation. It made a high-pitched, irritating sound that bounced off the concrete walls, but it was the only empty cart available, so I just had to deal with it. I pushed the squeaking cart all the way to aisle 12, deep into the center of the building. The overhead lights clicked on as I entered, illuminating the tall, dusty racks in front of me. The aisles on either side of me remained in total darkness. I parked the cart near a large stack of boxes and started matching serial numbers to my list. For the first hour, everything was perfectly normal. I just focused heavily on the tiny numbers on the labels. The only sounds in the huge building were the scratching of my pen, my own steady breathing, and the occasional hum of the heater kicking on somewhere near the ceiling. It was boring, repetitive work, but around 12:30 a.m. I experienced the first thing that made me feel genuinely uneasy. I was standing about halfway down aisle 12, looking closely at a faded barcode, when I heard something shift. The sound clearly came from aisle 13, right on the other side of the heavy metal racks. It sounded exactly like a large, heavy cardboard box being dragged forcefully across the concrete floor. It was a dull, heavy scraping sound that lasted for about 2 seconds and then stopped completely. I paused what I was doing, keeping my pen hovering right over the paper. I held my breath and listened closely. Nothing happened, just the faint, empty hum of the building. I waited a few more seconds, but the silence remained unbroken. I told myself it was just a heavy box settling. Sometimes the old wooden pallets shift under uneven weight, or maybe it was a rat. Large warehouses always have rats, even if you never actually see them. I shook my head, feeling a little silly for getting spooked so easily, and went right back to my clipboard, but my focus was completely broken. I found myself nervously staring at the small gaps between the boxes on the racks, trying to see into the dark aisle next to me. It was just a solid wall of black. I couldn't see anything at all through the narrow spaces. 15 minutes later, the lights in my aisle suddenly clicked off. I had been standing still for too long checking a complicated list. I was instantly swallowed by thick, heavy darkness. I sighed out loud, raised my arm, and waved it around heavily to trigger the sensor above me. The lights buzzed loudly and flickered back on. But the exact moment they did, something else happened that made my stomach drop. The lights in aisle 13 clicked on as well. I completely froze in place. The motion sensor in the next aisle had just been triggered. Someone or something had to have moved over there to make those lights turn on. My heart gave a sudden, hard thump in my chest. I stared at the bright white glow spilling onto the floor from the next aisle over. I didn't hear any footsteps at all. I didn't hear the heavy front door open earlier. I was supposed to be completely alone in the locked building. I called out nervously, asking if anyone was there. My voice sounded weak and small in the massive space. It echoed off the concrete walls and faded away into nothing. Nobody answered me. I slowly walked to the end of my aisle and nervously peeked around the corner into aisle 13. It was completely empty. The bright fluorescent lights illuminated nothing but dusty floors and wrapped wooden pallets. There was absolutely nobody standing there. I walked down the aisle slightly, checking behind the larger stacks of boxes just to be sure. Everything looked perfectly normal and untouched. I quickly convinced myself that the motion sensor was just old and faulty. Maybe a large moth flew past it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart down, and walked back to my squeaky cart in aisle 12. The safe feeling of being completely alone was gone. A heavy, very anxious feeling settled deep in my stomach. I decided to work much faster so I could just get back upstairs to the locked apartment and go to sleep. I grabbed the cold metal handle of my cart and started pushing it toward the next section of boxes. The annoying wheel echoed loudly again. I walked about 20 feet down the long aisle and then stopped to check another bright yellow label. When I stopped walking, the squeaking wheel stopped. But the sound of movement didn't stop. A fraction of a second after I stopped walking, I heard a very clear, distinct sound from the dark aisle next to me. It was the sound of a heavy shoe scuffing loudly against the concrete, just one single step, and then dead silence. My blood went completely cold. The sound was perfectly parallel to exactly where I was standing. Whatever had made that sound had stopped moving right when I stopped moving. I stood perfectly still next to the cart. I didn't even want to breathe out loud. My mind was racing fast, trying to find a logical, safe explanation. Maybe it was just a strange echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the high ceiling. I needed to test it to be sure. I slowly grabbed the cart handle again with shaking hands. I pushed it forward exactly 3 steps and then stopped abruptly. The cart squeaked 3 times and went silent. A brief second later, I heard 3 heavy, dragging steps from the dark aisle next to me. The sound came from the deep darkness of aisle 13 again. It absolutely wasn't an echo. The timing was slightly delayed. It was the clear sound of someone walking in the exact same rhythm as me, mimicking my movements perfectly. They were staying exactly on the other side of the heavy metal racks, completely hidden behind the tall walls of cardboard boxes. And the absolute scariest part was the motion lights in aisle 13 were not turning on at all. They were staying in the pitch black. Panic quickly started to bubble up in my throat. I slowly let go of the cart handle. I didn't want to make any more noise. I stood there in the dead silence of the warehouse, my eyes wide open, staring at the small vertical gaps between the boxes on the racks. I couldn't see anything but total darkness, but I could clearly feel a heavy, suffocating presence just a few feet away from me. Somebody was inside the locked building. Somebody was playing a very sick game with me in the dark. I decided to just walk toward the front office. I didn't want to run immediately because I didn't want to trigger a chase. I just started walking quickly and quietly, leaving the squeaky metal cart behind. I walked down the exact center of my aisle. As I walked, I heard the heavy footsteps keeping perfect pace with me on the other side of the racks. They weren't trying to hide the terrible sound anymore. It was a heavy, deliberate dragging sound. Like someone wearing thick work boots, lazily dragging their feet across the rough floor. I reached the far end of aisle 12 and turned left, walking quickly toward the large, open loading dock area at the very front of the warehouse. The heavy footsteps behind the racks hurried up quickly to match my new speed. I could actually hear them breathing heavily now. It was a low, wet wheezing sound that echoed terribly through the empty aisle. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my flashlight on the ground, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I just kept walking faster and faster toward the front doors. I finally burst out of the narrow aisles and into the wide open clearing near the main loading docks. The front office and the stairs up to the safe apartment were about 50 yards away. The pale moonlight was shining down through the high, frosted windows, casting long, creepy shadows across the smooth concrete floor. I stopped right in the middle of the clearing and turned around to face the dark aisles. I fully expected to see someone step out of the shadows. I expected to see a dangerous intruder holding a weapon. I stood there trembling uncontrollably, watching the dark, empty entrance to aisle 13. Nothing came out, but then the motion lights in aisle 12, the aisle I had just left, clicked off with a loud, aggressive buzz. Then the lights in aisle 11 clicked off automatically. Then aisle 10. The entire massive warehouse was slowly plunging into total darkness, section by section. It was almost as if whatever was in there was turning them off deliberately or absorbing the light. I took a shaky step backward toward the office. Then I heard the terrible sound again. But this time it didn't come from the dark aisles in front of me. It came from directly behind me, right over my left shoulder. It was the heavy, scraping sound of a boot slowly dragging on the concrete. It was so incredibly close, I could almost feel the vibration of it on the floor beneath my feet. I spun around quickly, my heart leaping violently into my throat. There was absolutely nothing there, just the empty, open space leading straight to the office doors. The air suddenly felt unnaturally freezing cold, chilling the nervous sweat on the back of my neck. I realized right then that whatever had been walking parallel to me hadn't stayed hidden inside the aisles. It had somehow moved completely behind me without making a single sound while I was distracted staring at the darkness. I didn't try to go up the stairs to the apartment. I didn't care about my warm coat or my personal things left inside. I simply turned and sprinted blindly toward the heavy metal side door that led straight out to the parking lot. I slammed my entire body heavily into the crash bar, bursting out into the freezing, empty night air. I ran across the dark asphalt, got into my car, locked the doors instantly, and drove out of the deserted industrial park as fast as I possibly could. I called my aunt the very next morning and told her I couldn't stay there anymore. I completely made up a lie about a sudden family emergency. I didn't want her to think I was crazy or hallucinating. A few days later, she decided to check the security camera footage from the loading dock area just to make sure I had actually locked the doors when I left. She called me back, sounding very confused. She told me the cameras clearly showed me running out of the building in an absolute panic at 1:15 a.m., but the cameras didn't show anyone else in the warehouse. There was no intruder anywhere. But there was one small detail she mentioned that still completely terrifies me to this day. She said that on the silent camera footage, right before I started frantically running, I stopped and quickly turned around. And when I turned around, a very tall, unnaturally distorted shadow stretched out across the concrete floor right behind me. A long, dark shadow that didn't match my shape at all and moved entirely on its own. It had been standing right behind me the entire time. Story 8. I used to take late-night walks during my trips to catch the last subway train. One night, I realized someone else had been walking the exact same route as me for weeks. My name is Emily. At the time, I was working the closing shift at a small coffee shop downtown. The only downside was the hours. By the time I finished cleaning the espresso machines and mopping the floors, it was usually pushing 1 in the morning. My commute home meant walking 4 blocks down a quiet, poorly lit street to get to the nearest subway entrance. Most nights, the walk was peaceful, but there was always this lingering feeling of being exposed. It was a straight shot down the avenue with nowhere to turn off. It started with the sound of footsteps a block or 2 back. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but as the weeks went on, I noticed a pattern. Whenever I worked late, the footsteps were there. They always kept their distance. If I sped up, the rhythm of the steps sped up. If I stopped to check my phone, the echoing clicks on the pavement stopped a few seconds later. I never saw anyone when I looked back. I just tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. That particular Tuesday night was freezing. I locked the cafe doors at exactly 12:45 a.m. and started my walk. The streets were completely dead. Not a single car drove past. I pulled my coat tighter and kept my head down. About 2 blocks in, I heard it, the faint, steady scrape of boots on the concrete behind me. My heart immediately started beating a little faster. I picked up my pace, practically speed walking toward the subway entrance. The footsteps behind me quickened, matching my exact speed. I didn't look back. I just wanted to get underground where there were cameras and hopefully a station attendant. I hurried down the concrete stairs into the subway, the heavy smell of damp earth hitting me immediately. I paused at the bottom, holding my breath, listening. I waited for a full minute, silence. The footsteps hadn't followed me down. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, figuring whoever it was had just walked past the entrance. The station was deserted. This wasn't unusual for 1:30 a.m., but the stillness in the air felt different tonight. The ticket booth was dark and locked tight. There was no attendant. It was just me, the harsh glare of the flickering fluorescent lights, and the distant hum of the ventilation system. I swiped my transit card. The sharp beep echoed loudly, making me flinch as I pushed through the turnstile and headed down the second set of stairs to the platform. The platform was a long stretch of faded concrete. The tracks disappeared into pitch-black tunnels in both directions. I glanced up at the digital display hanging from the ceiling. The orange letters glowed. The next train was arriving in 18 minutes. I walked over to a wooden bench and sat down. The wood was freezing. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, hoping to distract myself, but I had absolutely no cell service down here, just a dead signal. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and just looked around. Across the tracks, on the opposite platform, I noticed a discarded, crushed coffee cup sitting near the edge. It was from the cafe I worked at. Someone must have dropped it earlier in the day. It was a stupid, small detail, but my eyes locked onto it just to have something to focus on. The silence in the station was oppressive. It was so quiet that I could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere deep inside the tunnel to my right. Then the speakers crackled to life. It was a sharp, sudden burst of static that made me jump in my seat. I looked up at the black speaker box mounted on the ceiling above the platform. Usually an automated voice would announce delays or remind passengers to stand clear of the closing doors, but there was no chime, just a low, buzzing static that hissed through the empty station. I kept staring at the speaker, waiting for the recorded message. Instead, the static seemed to lower in volume, shifting into a soft, airy sound. It took me a few seconds to realize it wasn't just interference. It sounded like someone breathing into a microphone, slow, heavy breaths that echoed off the tiled walls. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I stood up from the bench, taking a step closer to the edge of the platform to look down the tracks, hoping to see the headlights of my train. There was nothing but darkness. The breathing on the speaker stopped, then a voice spoke. Emily. It was a whisper, scratchy, distorted by the old speakers, but undeniable. It had said my name. I froze, my entire body went rigid. I looked around wildly, scanning the empty platform, checking the stairs I had just come down. There was absolutely no one there. The station was completely empty. I tried to tell myself I misheard it. It was just a garbled, automated message. The train operator testing the intercom. My exhausted brain turning random noise into something familiar. A few seconds passed in heavy silence. I slowly sat back down on the edge of the bench, my eyes darting back and forth. The speaker crackled again. Emily. This time it was louder, clearer. It wasn't an automated glitch. It was a man's voice, keeping his tone hushed, speaking directly into the PA system. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up again, backing away from the platform edge, pressing my back against the cold tiled wall. Who was doing this? Where were they? The control booth upstairs was locked and completely dark. There was nowhere for anyone to be hiding. I saw you walk down the stairs, the whispering voice said. The sound bounced around the empty concrete cavern, making it impossible to tell exactly which speaker it was coming from. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. My mind instantly flashed back to the footsteps on the street, the person behind me. They hadn't kept walking past the entrance. They had come inside, but how did they get to the PA system? Were they in one of the maintenance rooms? Were they watching me right now? I looked up at the security cameras encased in black glass domes on the ceiling. Were they using the cameras to see me? "You look scared, Emily," the whisper echoed through the station. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. A deep, primal sense of panic took over my body. I wanted to run, but if I ran back up the stairs, I might run right into whoever was doing this. The only way out was the train. I looked desperately at the digital display. 12 minutes. I grabbed the strap of my bag, holding it tightly across my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. It sounded incredibly small and weak in the massive, empty space. The speaker let out a short, breathy chuckle. It was the most unsettling sound I had ever heard. It didn't sound human, it sounded hollow. "Don't look at the cameras," the whisper said. The voice seemed to have dropped in pitch. It sounded wetter, closer. "I'm not up there." I stopped looking at the ceiling. I scanned the platform again. Empty benches, support pillars, the crushed coffee cup still sitting on the opposite side. Nothing was out of place. The PA system clicked off. The sudden return to silence was almost worse than the whispering. My ears were ringing. I stood frozen against the wall, not daring to move a muscle. I just kept staring down the dark tunnel, praying to see the glow of an approaching train. 10 minutes passed. They were the longest 10 minutes of my entire life. Every dripping pipe, every gust of wind from the tunnel made my heart slam against my ribs. I kept expecting the speaker to crackle again, but it didn't. The silence stretched on, pulling my nerves tight like a wire about to snap. I glanced up at the sign. 2 minutes. Thank God, just 2 more minutes. Then I heard it. It wasn't coming from the speakers overhead. It was coming from the tunnel to my left, the dark tunnel where my train was supposed to emerge from. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like shoes dragging against the gravel between the train tracks. I slowly turned my head, terrified of what I was going to see. I peered into the pitch-black opening. The station lights only illuminated a few feet into the tunnel before the darkness swallowed everything. "Emily," a voice whispered. It wasn't amplified this time. It was raw, real, and it was coming from inside the tunnel, just beyond the reach of the light. I took a step back, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Someone was walking on the tracks, walking toward the platform, walking toward me. The dragging footsteps got louder. Scrape, step, scrape, step. They were slow, deliberate. Whatever was in there was in no rush. It knew I had nowhere to go. "I've been walking with you for a long time," the voice whispered from the dark. It sounded impossibly close now, maybe just 10 feet inside the tunnel. I saw a shape begin to form in the shadows, a tall silhouette separating itself from the blackness of the tunnel wall. It was just a person, but there was something entirely wrong about the way they moved. They were dragging their feet, walking with a strange, heavy limp over the wooden rail ties. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was completely paralyzed with fear. I pressed myself as hard as I could against the tiled wall, wanting to phase right through it. The silhouette stepped closer to the edge of the light. I saw the bottom of a dark, ragged coat. I saw pale, bare hands reaching out, not toward me, but gripping the edge of the concrete platform, pulling itself up. Suddenly, a powerful gust of wind blew out of the tunnel, whipping my hair across my face. A low rumble vibrated through the floor beneath my feet. The train. A blinding white light pierced the darkness of the tunnel, washing over everything. A deafening horn blasted, echoing violently through the station. I squeezed my eyes shut, throwing my hands over my ears as the massive metal train roared onto the platform, screeching to a halt right in front of me. The doors slid open with a sharp hiss. I didn't even look. I just lunged forward, throwing myself into the brightly lit train car. I scrambled into a plastic orange seat, pulling my knees up to my chest, gasping for air. The car was completely empty. I watched the door slide shut, locking with a solid thud. The train lurched forward, slowly gaining speed as it pulled out of the station. I kept my eyes fixed on the dirty window on the opposite side of the doors, looking out at the platform as it moved past. As the end of the platform came into view, right where the tunnel began, I saw something. Standing perfectly still in the harsh fluorescent light, right next to the edge of the drop-off, was the figure. I couldn't see a face under the shadow of their hood, but I saw it slowly raise a pale hand and point a single, long finger directly at the crushed coffee cup on the opposite platform, the cup from my cafe. The train sped up, plunging into the dark tunnel, leaving the station behind. I sat there in the empty, brightly lit car, my whole body shivering. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks was the only sound. I felt relatively safe for the first time in an hour. I was moving. I was getting away. I watched the dark walls of the tunnel blur past the window. My stop was only 3 stations away. I just had to hold it together for a few more minutes. The train began to slow down as it approached the next station. I stood up, moving toward the doors, ready to sprint the second they opened. The train came to a complete stop. But the doors didn't open. I stood there confused, waiting for the familiar hiss. Nothing happened. The platform outside was completely dark. The lights in the station were off. We had stopped at an abandoned, closed-down station. Then the intercom inside the empty train car crackled to life with a sharp burst of static. A slow, heavy breath hissed through the speaker right above my head. "Next stop," the whisper said, "Emily." Story 9. My roommate traveled a lot for work around the time of the rest stop bathroom incident. So when I heard him talking in his room at 3 a.m., I knew something was wrong. He wasn't home. But to explain why that moment terrified me to my core, I have to take you back to what happened 2 nights prior. I was making a long drive back to our shared apartment after visiting my parents. It was a miserable drive. The rain had been coming down in sheets for hours, turning the highway into a slick, black mirror. I had been behind the wheel since 10 p.m., and the exhaustion was starting to play tricks on my eyes. I knew I needed to pull over and stretch my legs, or I was going to end up in a ditch. The clock on my dashboard read 2:15 a.m. The highway was completely deserted. I hadn't seen another set of headlights in over 20 minutes, just endless stretches of dark pine trees lining both sides of the interstate. I kept the radio turned down low, listening to the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. It was almost lulling me to sleep. That was when I saw the blue sign glowing through the mist. It was a state-run rest area about 2 miles ahead. I felt a wave of relief. I just needed cold water on my face. I took the exit ramp, my tires splashing through deep puddles that had formed on the shoulder. The rest stop was tucked away behind a thick barrier of towering pine trees, completely hidden from the main highway. As my headlights swept across the parking lot, my initial relief quickly faded. The lot was completely empty. Not a single commercial truck, not a stray passenger car, just a wide, desolate expanse of wet asphalt under the dull orange glow of 3 street lamps. One of the lamps was flickering violently, casting jagged, dancing shadows across the concrete surface. I parked near the entrance of the main building. I didn't want to be in the dark any longer than necessary. I turned off the engine, and the sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. The only sound was the heavy rain drumming against my roof. I sat there for a minute, staring through the wet glass. It looked old, maybe built in the 70s. There were no windows on the front, just 2 heavy metal doors marked with faded men's and women's signs. I grabbed my keys, zipped my jacket up to my chin, and pushed my car door open. The freezing night air hit me instantly. I pulled my jacket tight against my chest and jogged through the heavy rain toward the men's room. My wet sneakers squeaked loudly against the concrete walkway. Every step felt unnaturally loud and exposed in the quiet night. I reached the heavy metal door, grabbed the freezing iron handle, and pulled it open. It dragged against the floor frame with a loud, grinding scrape that echoed out into the empty parking lot, making me wince. I stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the sound of the rain completely. The atmosphere inside was suffocating. The air was thick and humid, smelling strongly of industrial bleach and stagnant water. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, constant electrical hum. They flickered slightly, giving the whole room a pale, sickly yellow tint. I stood near the entrance for a moment, just listening. The silence in here felt heavier than the silence in my car. It felt expectant. The layout was simple, a row of 3 dirty sinks to my left, a cracked mirror spanning the wall above them. To my right, a row of 4 stalls with gray metal partitions. The doors to the first 3 stalls were wide open. The door to the last stall, the handicap-accessible one at the very end, was closed. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes those doors just rest closed. I walked over to the sinks, turned on the cold water, and splashed some on my face. The freezing water felt good. I grabbed a rough paper towel from the dispenser and dried my face, looking at my own tired reflection in the cracked glass. My eyes were bloodshot. I looked terrible. I threw the paper towel into the overflowing trash can and turned toward the stalls. I walked past the first 2 and stepped into the third one, right next to the large closed stall at the end. I latched the flimsy metal lock and hung my jacket on the hook on the door. It was as I was standing there in the quiet that I realized something was wrong. The silence wasn't complete. Beneath the buzzing of the lights, I could hear a sound coming from the closed stall next to me. It was breathing. It was incredibly shallow, but it was there, just a faint, rhythmic intake of air. Someone was in there, but I hadn't seen anyone's feet when I walked past, and there hadn't been any cars in the parking lot. A cold prickle of unease started to spread up the back of my neck. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe someone had walked over from a broken-down car on the highway, looking for shelter. Maybe a homeless person was sleeping on the floor in there to stay out of the freezing rain. That would explain why I didn't see feet under the partition when I walked in. I tried my best to ignore it. I focused on finishing up and getting out of there as quickly as humanly possible. The electrical hum of the lights suddenly felt overwhelmingly loud, pressing against my eardrums. I was just about to reach for the toilet paper when it happened. Tap, a single, soft knock on the metal partition wall separating my stall from the large one. It wasn't a bump or an accident. It was a deliberate, sharp tap with a knuckle. I froze completely. My hand stopped in midair. I held my breath, straining my ears, nothing but the buzzing lights. I stood there perfectly still for at least 30 seconds. I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that it was just the pipes settling or the metal expanding in the cold. I exhaled slowly, trying to relax my tense shoulders, but then it happened again. Tap, tap. 2 deliberate knocks, slightly louder this time, right beside my head. The metal wall vibrated slightly against my shoulder. Panic flared in my chest. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I didn't know what to do. My brain felt completely blank. Without thinking, running purely on a weird mix of fear and nervous reflex, I raised my hand. I knocked back on the metal wall. 2 taps, tap, tap. I immediately regretted it. Why did I do that? Why would I engage with whoever or whatever was hiding in the dark stall next to me? I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could take it back. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence. Even the shallow breathing seemed to have stopped. Then the response came. Tap, tap. It was the exact same rhythm, the exact same pressure. They were copying me. The air in the stall suddenly felt freezing cold. My hands started to shake. I wanted to unlock the door and run, but my legs felt like lead. I was paralyzed by a bizarre, morbid curiosity and a suffocating sense of dread. I reached out again. My hand was trembling violently. I tapped a slightly more complicated rhythm. 1, 2, pause, 1. Tap, tap, tap. I pulled my hand back quickly, feeling like a complete idiot playing games with a stranger in a desolate rest stop at 2:30 in the morning. The silence stretched out. I thought maybe I had scared them off, or they thought I was crazy. But then the wall vibrated. Tap, tap, tap. Perfect execution, but it wasn't just knuckles anymore. It sounded harder, like the smooth, hard surface of a fingernail striking the painted metal. And it was lower down on the partition, closer to the floor. I looked down at the gap beneath the metal wall. The light in the bathroom was dim, casting deep shadows under the stalls. I couldn't see any shoes. I couldn't see any clothing. There was just empty space. Then the knocking pattern changed without my input. It started at the bottom of the partition wall near the floor. Tap, tap, tap. Then it moved up, tap, tap, tap. It was moving higher and higher up the metal divider, climbing toward the ceiling. The rhythm was getting faster, more frantic. It sounded like dozens of fingers drumming against the thin metal, swarming over the surface. The sound filled the small space, echoing loudly off the tiled walls. The shallow breathing I heard earlier was gone, replaced by a low, wet scratching sound accompanying the frantic knocking. That broke my paralysis. I shoved the stall door open and practically fell out into the main walkway. I didn't look back. I sprinted out into the freezing rain, jumped into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. I sped down the highway until the sun came up. I finally made it back to the apartment, completely exhausted. I thought I had left whatever that was far behind me. But then 2 nights later, at 3 a.m., I heard my roommate talking in his dark bedroom. I crept out into the hallway, confused. He was out of town. I stood outside his closed door, just listening. He wasn't talking. It was just an old television playing softly inside. I was about to walk away and go back to bed, and then clear as day through our shared drywall came the response. Tap, tap, tap. Story 10. I found a hidden folder on my laptop one morning after my shift on the parking garage level. When I opened it, the pictures inside showed me sleeping every single night. I'm 24 years old, and at the time I was living in downtown Chicago. I had just gotten a job working overnight security for a massive commercial property management company. The pay was decent, but the shifts were brutal. The company managed a towering, modern skyscraper right in the heart of the business district. It was an impressive building, but it had a sprawling underground parking structure that stretched down 6 levels below the street. Because I was the newest hire on the night crew, I was assigned to patrol the deepest, most isolated areas. My main responsibility was monitoring level -5. It was late January, right in the middle of a miserable winter deep freeze. The night shifts were always quiet, but that particular Thursday felt completely dead. My supervisor had asked me to do a final perimeter check before taking my lunch break at 3:15 a.m. By the time I grabbed my heavy flashlight, clipped my radio to my belt, and stepped out of the security office, the entire building was deserted. The overhead fluorescent lights in the main lobby had already switched over to their dim, energy-saving night mode. I grabbed my heavy winter coat, packed my dinner into my bag, and headed for the service elevators. The silence in the building was heavy. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring slightly. I swiped my security badge to call the elevator, and the loud ding of the arriving car actually made me jump. I stepped inside and pressed the button for level -5. The doors slid shut, sealing me into the small, brightly lit metal box. I watched the digital floor indicator tick slowly downward, feeling a growing sense of isolation with every passing second. When the doors finally opened on my level, a blast of freezing air hit my face. The underground garage wasn't heated, and the concrete seemed to trap the bitter cold from the street level above. I stepped out of the elevator bay and into the cavernous parking area. The smell down there was always the same, a stale mix of car exhaust, damp concrete, and old motor oil. The overhead sodium vapor lights hummed with a low, electrical buzz. Several of the bulbs were flickering, casting long, erratic shadows across the empty space. Part of my patrol routine involved walking the entire perimeter of the structure. It was easily a half-mile walk, weaving through rows of massive concrete support pillars. Looking out across the vast floor, I realized I was the only person down there. There were maybe 3 employee cars parked on the entire level, scattered far apart. I pulled my jacket tighter around my neck, adjusted the heavy flashlight in my grip, and started my long walk down the first aisle. I was wearing heavy winter boots with thick rubber soles. They made a distinct, heavy thud against the concrete with every step I took. Thud, thud, thud. It was a rhythmic, comforting sound at first, but as I walked deeper into the garage, moving further away from the bright lights of the elevator bay, I started to notice something strange about the acoustics. The space was enormous and completely empty, so I expected my footsteps to echo, but the sound bouncing back to me felt wrong. An echo is supposed to happen almost instantly. It reflects off the walls and returns right after you make the initial noise, but the sound I was hearing behind me was slightly delayed. It was just a fraction of a second too late to be a natural reflection of my own movement. I kept walking, slowing my pace just a little to listen more closely. Thud, 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 then slightly out of sync behind me in the darkness. Scuff, scuff, scuff. I frowned, my chest tightening slightly. The sound behind me was slowing down along with my pace, but it didn't sound like my boots. My boots made a solid, blunt impact. The sound echoing behind me was different. It sounded like the dragging scrape of a rough, worn-out shoe sliding against the cement floor. It was heavier, sloppier. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I had been awake for over 18 hours. My brain was exhausted, and enclosed underground spaces naturally distort sound in weird ways. To prove to myself that I was just imagining things, I decided to test it. I stopped walking entirely. I froze mid-step, planting my feet firmly on the freezing concrete. The heavy silence of the parking garage immediately crashed back down around me, but it wasn't instant. After I stopped, the sound behind me took one extra step. Let's go. It was distinct, unmistakable. Someone else was down there with me. My heart did a painful flip in my chest. I stood perfectly still, clutching the cold metal of my flashlight so tightly my fingers went numb. I held my breath, straining my ears to hear anything over the low, buzzing hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I expected to hear someone clear their throat or jingle their car keys or just keep walking past me, but there was nothing. Whoever or whatever had made that sound was now standing perfectly still in the darkness behind me. A cold sweat broke out along my hairline, despite the freezing temperature in the garage. I slowly turned my head, peering over my shoulder into the dimly lit rows of concrete pillars. The flickering lights made the shadows dance and shift, creating illusions of movement in the corners of my vision, but I couldn't see anyone. There was no shape hiding behind the pillars, no silhouette standing in the empty parking spaces. It was just me. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded pathetic. It was thin, shaky, and immediately swallowed by the vast emptiness of the garage. It echoed off the distant walls, returning to me as a faint, mocking whisper. There was no reply, just the humming lights and the terrifying, heavy silence. Every instinct in my body was suddenly screaming at me to move. I turned my head forward and started walking again. But this time I didn't care about the cold or the exhaustion. I was walking fast. Almost immediately, the sound behind me started up again. Scuff, 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 but the delay was growing longer. It was no longer mimicking my rhythm at all. The footsteps behind me were steady, deliberate, and entirely independent of my own movement. I was walking quickly, my boots practically slapping against the concrete, but the heavy dragging steps behind me were taking their time. They were maintaining a constant distance, following me with a casual, terrifying patience. I was about 50 yards from my own car now, which I had parked down here for my shift. I could see the outline of it parked near the back wall. I reached a trembling hand into my coat pocket and gripped my keys. I fumbled frantically, feeling for the unlock button on the key fob. The dragging footsteps behind me suddenly changed. They stopped being slow and casual. They sped up. The slow scuffing turned into loud, heavy thuds that echoed aggressively off the low ceiling. The distance between us was closing fast. Panic completely took over. I abandoned any attempt to stay calm and broke into a full sprint. My heavy bag slammed painfully against my hip with every stride, but I didn't care. I just ran. The heavy footsteps behind me broke into a run as well. It sounded like someone large and incredibly heavy charging directly at my back. The terrifying noise was so loud and so close I thought I could almost feel the vibration in the concrete floor beneath my feet. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob. My car's orange hazard lights flashed in the dim distance, illuminating the concrete wall for a split second. I reached the driver's side door, yanked the handle hard, and threw my entire body inside the vehicle. I slammed the heavy metal door shut behind me and frantically smashed the master lock button on the armrest. The loud, mechanical clunk of the locks engaging sent a brief wave of relief washing over me. I scrambled over the center console, making sure all the other doors were secured. Then I pressed my back against the driver's seat, gasping for air. My chest was heaving and my hands were shaking violently. I slowly leaned forward and peered out the driver's side window, fully expecting to see a face pressed against the glass or someone standing right outside my door. I braced myself for the impact of a hand slamming against the window. But there was nothing. The parking garage was completely empty. I stared out into the rows of concrete pillars and flickering lights, my mind completely unable to process what was happening. The footsteps had been inches away from me. I had heard them charging at my back, but there was absolutely no one there. There was nowhere to hide that quickly. The physical reality of the empty space directly contradicted the terrifying sounds I had just experienced. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I threw the car into drive and hit the gas, tires screeching as I sped up the spiraling ramps. I didn't breathe until I burst onto the brightly lit city streets. I drove straight home, locked my door, and collapsed onto my bed, convinced my exhaustion had caused a hallucination. It was the only logical explanation, but my sense of safety shattered the next morning. When I opened my laptop, a strange new folder was sitting on my desktop. The thing in the garage hadn't just been hunting me, it had been following me home. Story 11. It was the first night in the private study room I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I was a graduate student burdened by a massive thesis paper. My noisy apartment was useless for focusing, so I booked a private study room on the 4th floor of the university library. This section was famously quiet and mostly used by faculty. The main library closed at midnight, but grad students with keycards could stay in these private rooms overnight. I desperately needed uninterrupted time, so I planned to stay until sunrise. I arrived around 9 p.m., walking down the narrow hallway of the 4th floor. The layout felt a little unsettling, lined with solid wooden doors on either side. The only way to see inside or outside was through a tiny, thick rectangular pane of glass set at eye level. I pushed open the door to room 412. It was bare, holding only a metal desk, a trash can, and an incredibly heavy oak chair. Above the desk was a wide, rusted air vent blowing weak, cold air. I pulled the heavy chair out, wincing at the loud scrape against the floor, and unpacked my laptop. For the first few hours, everything went exactly to plan. Occasionally, I would hear the faint sound of a door clicking shut down the corridor as people packed up for the night. Around 11:45 p.m., an automated voice announced the library was closing. I ignored it, completely focused on my screen. By midnight, the distant sounds of movement faded entirely. At 12:15 a.m., the hallway lights clicked off with a loud thud. The library had switched to its overnight power-saving mode. The tiny window in my door now looked out into absolute, pitch-black darkness. My room was the only source of light. Sitting in that bright white light, surrounded by concrete walls, I felt incredibly exposed. Anyone standing in the dark hallway could see perfectly into my room, but I wouldn't see them. I tried to shake the paranoid feeling off and put my noise-canceling headphones back on, listening to quiet music. But an hour later, something broke my concentration. The air in the room felt suddenly thick. I got that primal, unsettling feeling on the back of my neck, like someone was standing directly behind me. I paused my music and pulled my headphones down, listening closely. At first, there was only the vent. But as I sat perfectly still, another sound slowly separated itself from the background noise. It was the sound of breathing. a slow, steady rhythm of air being drawn in and pushed out. Inhale, exhale. I froze in the heavy chair, hands hovering over the keyboard. I immediately stopped breathing myself, terrified I was just hearing the echo of my own lungs, but the sound didn't stop. It was wet and slightly raspy, like someone with a bad cold trying to take quiet breaths. My eyes darted around the tiny, fully illuminated room. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. I looked up at the air vent, trying to rationalize the sound. Old pipes can create weird auditory illusions, picking up sounds from different floors. I desperately wanted to believe that, forcing myself to stare at my screen. But my mind was entirely focused on the space behind me. Every instinct screamed that something was very wrong. After 20 minutes of agonizing fake productivity, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave the room, walk down the hall, and prove to myself that the building was just noisy. I pushed my chair back, the scraping sound echoing violently. As soon as the scraping sound stopped, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The breathing had stopped entirely. The room was dead silent, with no hum from the vent. It felt exactly like a living person holding their breath because they had just been noticed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slowly stood up and turned around to face the empty room. Nothing was there. I walked over to the heavy wooden door, desperate to get out. I grabbed the cold metal handle and pulled down. It didn't move. I pulled harder, putting my weight into it, but it was completely locked. Panic flooded my chest. I grabbed the handle with both hands and jiggled it violently, the metal rattling loudly. These doors locked automatically from the outside, but they were never supposed to lock from the inside. There wasn't even a locking mechanism on my side. I slammed my shoulder against the thick wood, but it felt like pushing against a solid brick wall. I peered frantically through the small window into the hallway, hoping to see a security guard. There was only darkness. I was completely trapped inside this concrete box. I backed away from the door, gasping for air. I pulled my phone out, my hands shaking terribly. 0 bars. The concrete walls completely blocked all cellular reception. I was cut off from the outside world. Trapped at 2:30 a.m., I leaned my back against the locked door, staring wildly around the bright room. And then the breathing started again. It wasn't coming from the vent anymore. It sounded like it was coming from the back left corner of the room, near the small metal trash can. I stared at the empty space, wide-eyed with terror. The sound was unmistakable. Inhale, exhale. It was louder now, heavier. I could almost feel the slight displacement of air with every breath. I pressed my back harder against the door, opening my mouth to yell, but my throat was entirely dry. I was paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt like ice in my veins. Then the impossible happened. The sound moved. I didn't see a shadow or hear footsteps, but the distinct, wet sound of the breathing physically shifted. It drifted slowly from the corner, moving along the far wall, hovering near the center of the room. It sounded like an invisible mass was slowly packing the small space. I tracked the sound with my eyes as it moved from the center over to the right side. It was circling the empty space. The sheer psychological torture of being locked in a small box with something I could hear but couldn't see was pushing me toward the edge of losing my mind. I slid slowly down the heavy wooden door until I was sitting on the cold linoleum floor. I pulled my knees tightly to my chest and wrapped my arms around them, closing my eyes. For what felt like hours, the sound continued. It would move to one side of the room, pause, and then slowly drift to the other side. Every time it passed near the center, it sounded slightly closer to me. Sometime around 4:15 a.m., the packing stopped. The sound settled right in the middle of the room, the heavy breathing echoing loudly in my ears. I kept my head buried in my knees, quietly sobbing, just waiting for whatever it was to finally touch me, but nothing touched me. Eventually, around 5:30 a.m., the breathing simply stopped. It ceased entirely in the middle of an exhale. The room was suddenly plunged back into true silence. I stayed curled in a ball on the floor, too terrified to move a muscle, convinced it was just holding its breath again. My entire body ached from the tension. Around 6:15 a.m., the light in the room changed slightly. I slowly lifted my head. Through the small rectangular window, I could see the main hallway lights had finally been turned back on. A few minutes later, I heard the heavy, metallic jingle of keys echoing down the hallway. Real, physical footsteps were approaching my door. The face of an older campus security guard appeared in the glass window. He looked inside, his eyes widening in confusion when he saw me sitting on the floor in the corner. I heard a key slide into the lock on the outside. The door was pushed open. Fresh air rushed in, and I scrambled to my feet, legs trembling. The guard looked at me with deep concern and asked what I was doing on the floor. I didn't try to explain. I knew exactly how crazy it would sound. I stumbled over to the desk, shoved my laptop into my backpack, and practically ran out of the room. Stepping into the bright hallway made me feel lighter. The guard stepped out of my way, looking at me like I was unhinged. As I hurried toward the stairwell, desperate to leave, I paused for a brief second and looked back down the hall. The guard was standing right in the doorway of my study room, looking confused. I watched as he took a slow step inside, looking around the empty concrete box. He looked at the heavy oak chair. Then his entire body stiffened. He stopped moving completely, freezing mid-step. He just stood there, staring intently at the empty back corner of the room, his head tilted slightly as if he was straining to listen to something. The color drained from his face. I didn't stick around to see what he would do next. I just sprinted down the stairs and out into the morning light. I never went back to that library again. Sometimes, when the apartment gets quiet, I stop my own breathing, just to make sure I'm the only one making noise. Story 12. Back in 2019, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. It was an independent station off a lonely stretch of highway in upstate New York. I took the job because I was a student and desperately needed extra money. The night shift paid more, and my manager told me it was basically getting paid to sit and read. From 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., I was the only employee. Most nights I'd see maybe 3 customers total. The rest of the time it was just me, the fluorescent lights, and the endless humming of the refrigeration units. I usually liked the quiet. I would sit behind the register and drink stale coffee. But there's a very specific isolation that comes with working in a glass box surrounded by total darkness. You can see out into the illuminated parking lot, but past the glow of the canopy lights, the world drops off into pitch black. You have absolutely no idea what is out there looking in at you. There was this one old motion sensor light on the side of the building above the ice machine. It was notoriously faulty. Sometimes the wind would blow a branch and the floodlight would snap on, blindingly bright, before clicking off a few minutes later. You get used to things like that when you spend 40 hours a week alone in the dark. You convince yourself every sudden noise is just the building settling or faulty wiring. That was the mindset I had going into that Tuesday night in late November. I had clocked in, counted the register drawer, and settled onto my stool behind the main counter. For the first few hours it was dead. Not a single car drove past on the highway. I spent the time wiping down counters, restocking shelves, and trying to read. Around 1:30 a.m. I got up to dump out the old coffee and brew a fresh pot. The coffee station was against the far left wall, directly next to a massive pane of floor-to-ceiling glass. As I poured the dark liquid down the drain, I casually glanced out the window. The parking lot was empty. The 4 gas pumps stood there like silent metal statues under the canopy lights, but my eyes were drawn past the pumps, to the very edge of the pavement where the asphalt met the overgrown grass. Standing just barely inside the reach of the street lamp was a person. I stopped pouring the coffee and stared. It was too far away to make out specific details, but I could tell it was a man. He was wearing a dark, heavy coat, and he was standing completely still, facing the store. My initial reaction wasn't fear. It was more of a mild, unsettling confusion. It wasn't completely unusual to get drifters passing through, but usually they would walk straight up to the doors. This guy was just standing there, motionless, at the absolute edge of the light. I watched him for a solid minute. He didn't shift his weight at all. He didn't look down. He just stood there, angled perfectly toward the brightly lit windows. I tried to brush it off. I told myself he was waiting for a ride, or maybe he had walked from a broken-down car further up the dark road. I turned my back to the window, finished starting the new pot of coffee, and walked back behind the safety of the main counter. From the register, my view of that specific spot was partially blocked by a display of cheap sunglasses. I sat back down on my stool and picked up my textbook, determined to ignore him. But reading suddenly felt impossible. Every time I tried to focus on a sentence, my eyes would instinctively dart toward the front windows. I felt that heavy, uncomfortable, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling that you are being watched. It's a primal instinct, I think. Your body knows when unseen eyes are focused on it, even if your logical brain is telling you to calm down. After about 15 minutes of pretending to read, I couldn't take the suspense anymore. I leaned slowly to my left, peering carefully around the sunglasses display to check the edge of the parking lot again. He was still there, but he had moved. He was no longer at the edge of the grass. He was now standing right next to pump number 4, the one furthest from the building, and he was still standing in that exact same unnatural, rigid posture. Both arms were hanging straight down at his sides, shoulders incredibly stiff, facing directly at me. I could see him a little more clearly under the pump canopy lights now. The heavy coat was a dark, dirty green color. The hood was pulled up tight over his head, casting his entire face in a deep, impenetrable shadow. My heart gave a slightly harder thud against my ribs. There was something deeply wrong with the way he was standing. It didn't look like someone waiting for a friend. It looked incredibly deliberate. It looked predatory. I reached under the counter and rested my hand on the heavy metal flashlight we kept next to the panic button. He hadn't actually done anything illegal. He was just standing outside in the cold. I swallowed hard, trying to push the growing panic back down into my stomach. I forced myself to stand up. I decided that acting completely normal was the best defense I had. If he saw that I was clearly terrified, maybe that would somehow encourage him to come closer. so I grabbed a clean rag and a bottle of glass cleaner from the shelf under the register and started wiping down the inside of the front windows. I was trembling slightly, but I wanted to send a clear message. I wanted to show him that I was fully aware of him, that I was just doing my job, and that I wasn't intimidated by his staring. I kept my eyes focused firmly on the glass, making broad, sweeping motions with the damp rag. But every single time I made a pass across the window, I caught him in my peripheral vision, still standing there, still just staring from under that dark hood. I moved slowly from the main front doors over to the side windows near the snack aisle. The constant hum of the commercial refrigerators felt deafeningly loud in the silent, empty store. I was hyper-aware of every single small sound I made, the squeak of my shoes on the linoleum, the spray of the glass cleaner, my own shallow breathing. I finished the window near the potato chips and turned around to put the supplies away. When I walked back behind the register and looked out at pump number 4 again, my stomach completely dropped. The space right next to the gas pump was totally empty. He was gone. There was absolutely no sign of him anywhere in the illuminated parking lot. He hadn't walked toward the highway and he hadn't come inside the store. He had just vanished into the night. You would think that seeing him disappear would bring a massive wave of relief, but it did the exact opposite to me. When he was standing by the pump, at least I knew exactly where he was. Now he was somewhere out in the darkness, and I had absolutely no idea where. I stood frozen behind the counter, my eyes frantically scanning the perimeter of the light. Nothing, not a single shadow, not a trace of movement. I checked the small monitor under the counter that showed the 4 exterior security cameras. The live feeds were incredibly low quality, mostly just black and gray static with vague, glowing outlines of the pumps. I stared at the tiny screen until my eyes burned, desperately looking for any shift in the pixels. There was nothing. The digital clock on the register read 2:45 a.m. I still had over 3 hours left in my shift. I slowly lowered myself back onto the stool, pulling my knees tightly up to my chest. I desperately tried to tell myself he simply got bored of freezing outside and walked away. He was probably a mile down the road by now. I repeated that comforting thought in my head over and over like a mantra, trying to force my racing heart rate back down to a normal pace. I sat there in tense silence for another 30 minutes. The building was painfully quiet. The wind had completely died down outside, leaving the night still and heavy. Around 3:15 a.m. I finally started to relax just a fraction. My tight grip on the heavy metal flashlight loosened slightly. I let out a long, shaky exhale and leaned forward to rest my elbows on the counter. Then I heard it, a sound so sharp and completely out of place that it made my entire body violently flinch. Tap. Tap, tap. I froze instantly. My brain frantically tried to rationalize it. A branch hitting the roof, the ice machine dropping cubes, but the sound wasn't coming from the ceiling and it wasn't coming from the back room. The noise was coming from directly behind me. I sat completely paralyzed, my breath trapped in my throat. The front doors and the main windows were all clearly visible in front of me. Behind me was a solid wall of cigarette displays, and to the immediate right of that was a single, narrow, heavily tinted window that looked out into the unlit blind alleyway beside the building. That was exactly where the faulty motion sensor light was located, the security light that had not turned on. Whoever was tapping on that glass had carefully stayed in the pitch-black blind spot all along, waiting silently just inches away from my back. Story 13. This happened during my summer alone in the Firewatch Tower. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. The Firewatch Tower was essentially a tiny wooden cabin perched on top of 40 feet of rusted steel framing. My name is Tyler, and I took the job because I desperately needed the quiet. I was going through a rough patch, and spending 3 months completely isolated in the dense pine forests of the Pacific Northwest sounded like the perfect escape. My daily routine was incredibly monotonous, but I appreciated the calm. The only connection I had to the outside world was a bulky 2-way radio bolted to a small desk near the center of the room. It was meant strictly for official use. Every day at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. sharp, I did a mandatory check-in with the central dispatch station miles away in the valley. A supervisor named Greg would usually answer, confirm my status, and then the radio would go dead silent for another 12 hours. For the first 6 weeks, the isolation was peaceful, but eventually, the sheer weight of the absolute silence started to mess with my head. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in mid-August. The weather had been unusually dry for weeks, turning the surrounding forest into a giant tinderbox. My nerves were already on edge because of the responsibility, but the oppressive heat that lingered even after the sun went down made it hard to relax. It was around 11:15 p.m. The sky was pitch black, with thick clouds covering the moon. Up in the tower at night, the large wraparound windows turn into giant black mirrors. If you have a light on inside, you cannot see anything out in the darkness, only your own reflection staring back. Because of this, I hated using the main overhead light. I was sitting at my desk, reading a paperback novel by the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern. The cabin was completely silent. The wind had died down, leaving the air feeling heavy. I was just turning the page of my book when I heard it. A sudden, sharp crackle of static broke the silence. I jumped in my chair, my heart doing a quick flip in my chest. I looked over at the radio. It was supposed to be completely dead at this hour. Nobody ever broadcasted on this frequency at night unless there was an active wildfire. I stared at the dark plastic casing, waiting for Greg's voice to come through, demanding an update or warning me about a lightning strike. But nothing happened. The static stopped just as abruptly as it had started, leaving the heavy silence to rush back into the small room. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. I told myself it was just a random burst of atmospheric interference. Sometimes storms hundreds of miles away could cause the radio waves to bounce weirdly, sending brief blips of static through the receiver. I forced myself to look back down at my book. About 20 minutes passed. I was finally starting to relax again, sinking back into the story when the radio hissed to life a second time. This time the static was louder, more aggressive. It lasted for a few seconds before settling into a low, steady hum, and then I heard a voice. Tyler. It was incredibly faint, buried underneath the electronic hissing, but it was definitely my name. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the speaker, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. Only my supervisor knew my name, but this voice sounded completely flat and emotionless, like someone reading a word off a piece of paper without understanding what it meant. I leaned closer to the radio, my hands trembling slightly as I grabbed the attached microphone. I pressed the transmission button on the side, asking who was there, my voice cracking slightly. I let go of the button and waited, my ears straining against the silence. There was no response. The channel was completely empty. I sat there for 10 minutes with the microphone clutched in my sweating palm, but the radio remained silent. The unease in my stomach quickly curdled into genuine fear. I desperately tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the isolated silence, but a cold knot of dread remained anchored in my chest. Time dragged on agonizingly slowly. It was now 12:45 a.m. I had given up on reading entirely. I was just sitting in the dim lantern light, staring blankly at the wall, listening to the absolute stillness of the forest outside. The isolation that had once felt comforting now felt like a trap. I was suspended 40 feet in the air, miles away from another human being. Then the radio clicked on again. There was no static this time. The connection was perfectly clear. Tyler, come down here. All the blood drained from my face, my breathing completely stopped. The voice coming out of the speaker was not flat and emotionless like before. It was clear, natural, and completely horrifying. Because the voice asking me to come down was my own, it sounded exactly like me. The pitch, the cadence, the slight raspiness, it was a perfect, flawless replica of how I speak. A wave of sheer terror washed over me. I stumbled backwards away from the desk, my back hitting the opposite wall of the cabin. Why would someone be broadcasting a recording of me over the emergency channel? How would they even get a recording of me saying that phrase? It made absolutely no sense. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed me. I stared at the radio as if it were a dangerous animal. The fear was localized entirely inside this tiny room, coming right out of that little black box. I realized I was panting, taking short, shallow breaths. I reached out and shut off the small battery-powered lantern, plunging the cabin into total darkness. Without the light inside reflecting against the glass, I could finally see out the windows. The moonlight had broken through the clouds, casting pale, ghostly shadows across the tops of the pine trees. I slowly crept toward the window that faced the only access road. I pressed my face against the cool glass and peered down at the base of the tower. I expected to see a truck parked there, or maybe someone holding a handheld radio, but there was nothing, just empty dirt and shadows. And then I heard it again, but this time it didn't come from the radio speaker. It came from outside, from the darkness directly beneath the cabin. Tyler, come down here. The exact same phrase, the exact same perfect imitation of my own voice. Only this time it wasn't filtered through electronics. It was raw, real, and echoing straight up through the thick wooden floorboards beneath my feet. It was completely impossible, but I heard it with my own ears. Someone or something was standing right at the base of the steel structure, 40 feet below, casually calling up to me in the dead of the night. A heavy, suffocating panic gripped my chest. I slowly dropped to my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp splinters of the old wood biting into my skin. I crawled across the floor toward the heavy metal trapdoor that led down to the exterior staircase. I didn't dare open it. I simply pressed my ear against the cold iron hinge and held my breath, listening with every fiber of my being. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only the gentle rustle of wind through the branches. Then I heard a sound that made my stomach completely drop. a heavy, metallic clank. Then another clank. Someone had stepped onto the bottom rung of the steel staircase. They were coming up. The footsteps were impossibly slow and heavy. There was a long, deliberate pause between every single step, as if whatever was climbing had all the time in the world. I frantically reached for the heavy iron sliding bolt on the trapdoor and shoved it into the locked position. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost couldn't move the metal mechanism. The footsteps continued upward. They passed the halfway mark, then 3/4. I backed away into the farthest corner of the tiny cabin, pulling my knees to my chest, unable to tear my eyes away from the trapdoor. The footsteps reached the small metal landing directly outside the door. They stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever experienced. I waited for a violent banging on the door or a sudden attempt to rip it open, but nothing happened. There was just absolute stillness on the other side of the wood. I stayed huddled in that dark corner for 6 hours until the sun finally broke over the horizon, bathing the forest in golden morning light. The moment I felt safe enough to move, I grabbed the radio, bypassed the dispatcher entirely, and called for an emergency evacuation, lying about a severe medical issue. When the rescue chopper arrived, the pilot noted that the metal trapdoor was covered in deep, erratic scratches on the outside, as if someone had been quietly clawing at it all night. I quit the forestry service that same afternoon and never returned to the Pacific Northwest. I still occasionally have nightmares about that night, but the part that haunts me the most isn't the scratches on the trapdoor. It's the chilling realization that whatever stood on that landing perfectly mimicked my voice to lure me out, and I have absolutely no idea how it learned to sound like me. Story 14. This happened on a cold the mall escalator ride night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. I was in my car in the empty parking lot of a closed mall. It was 2:15 a.m. I worked overnight inventory for a department store, spending hours in the dead building folding clothes and reorganizing shelves in complete isolation. I had just taken my break in my car to escape the heavy silence inside. My car was parked near a row of trees. The wind was blowing hard. I heard a soft, rhythmic tap against the passenger glass. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't even look at first, assuming it was wind blowing branches. But then I remembered I had parked 10 feet away from any tree. I turned my head slowly. Pressed against the dark glass was a pale hand, tapping softly with one finger. I couldn't see a face attached to it in the shadows. My heart dropped. I instantly hit the lock button. The hand stopped tapping, slid down the glass, and disappeared. I waited, frozen, before finally turning on my headlights. No one was there, no footprints. I debated driving home right then, but I would lose my job. Plus, the locked mall felt safer. I grabbed my access badge, sprinted to the employee entrance, and slipped inside. The heavy metal door locked firmly behind me, sealing out the cold wind. I leaned against it for a moment, just listening to my own uneven breathing. The inside of a closed mall at 2:30 a.m. feels wrong. Only the dim emergency lights remain on, casting long shadows across the floors. The silence is the worst part. Every step I took echoed down the massive, empty corridors. I needed to get back to the 3rd floor. I walked down the back hallway and pressed the service elevator button. Nothing happened. The elevators were shut down completely. That was unusual. With a frustrated sigh, I realized I had to walk out into the main concourse and use the center escalators. I pushed through the double doors into the main mall. It was even creepier out here. The skylights let in a pale gray moonlight. Mannequins stood frozen behind dark glass like shadowed people watching me. I kept my head down. The vast emptiness made me feel small and exposed. I reached the center atrium connecting all 3 floors. In the middle was a long, cascading set of escalators. Usually they were turned off at night, but as I got closer I heard a low, mechanical humming sound. I stopped and looked up. The upward escalator was running. The metal steps were steadily climbing. I stood at the bottom watching it. Why would one single escalator be running in the middle of the night? It was a massive waste of electricity. I looked around the empty atrium. There was no one else in sight. I was tired, and climbing 3 flights of stationary metal stairs didn't appeal to me. I stepped onto the moving grate and grabbed the handrail. The escalator carried me upward. The rhythmic clanking of the steps was hypnotic. As I rose above the 1st floor, I looked over the edge. The ground floor slowly shrank away below me. I felt a chill in the air and pulled my jacket tighter, staring ahead. It usually takes about 30 seconds to ride to the 2nd floor, but as I stood there, I realized something was wrong. I looked down at my watch. It was 2:34 a.m. I looked back up. The top of the escalator still looked just as far away as when I first stepped on. I looked down over the railing. The 1st floor was far beneath me, almost swallowed by shadows. I had passed the 2nd floor landing entirely, but the escalator wasn't stopping. It kept continuing upward even though the mall only had 3 floors. I looked up. The atrium ceiling was nowhere in sight. The escalator seemed to stretch into a hazy, dark distance. Panic prickled at the back of my neck. This was impossible. I gripped the strangely cold rubber handrail. I told myself I was just tired, that the shadows were messing with my depth perception. I closed my eyes tightly, telling myself that when I opened them, I would be at the 3rd floor landing. But when I opened my eyes, I was still moving upward. There was only darkness below me and endlessly moving stairs ahead. The silence up here was different from the rest of the mall. It felt heavy, almost suffocating, like I had crossed into somewhere else entirely. I felt completely isolated, cut off from the real world. My heart pounded hard. I turned around to look down. The metal steps fell away into the blackness like a waterfall. I had a sudden, terrifying urge to run back down and escape, but looking into that void made me dizzy. I had to keep going up. That was when I saw it. I wasn't alone on the escalator. A few dozen steps ahead of me, near the edge of the shadows, someone was standing. I gasped out loud. I hadn't seen anyone step on before me, but there they were. A person, standing perfectly still, facing away from me, riding up just like I was. I stared at the figure, my breathing shallow. It was a person wearing a dark, heavy coat. Their shoulders were slumped forward. They weren't holding the handrails. Their arms just hung limply at their sides. They stood so incredibly still, not swaying with the movement of the stairs. They didn't look around. Relief and fear washed over me. Maybe it was a security guard. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I called out. My voice sounded weak, swallowed up by the open darkness. The figure didn't react. They didn't turn around. They didn't even twitch. I tried again, louder. "Hey, do you know what's going on?" I yelled. Nothing. Not a single movement. The only sound was the relentless clanking of the metal stairs. We were both moving at the exact same speed, trapped on this strange ride. A deep dread settled in my stomach. Something was terribly wrong with that person. I don't know how long we rode like that. It felt like hours. Eventually, the darkness ahead began to clear. I saw a flat landing approaching. It wasn't the 3rd floor. There were no storefronts, just a plain, gray concrete platform bathed in flickering fluorescent light. The figure reached the top first and stepped off onto the concrete. They didn't walk away, they just stopped right at the edge of the escalator, back still facing me. I was approaching the top quickly. The gap was closing. 10 steps, 5 steps, 2 steps. Terrified, I let the stairs carry me up to the landing. I stepped off onto the cold concrete, standing only a few feet behind them. I stood frozen, unable to speak. I stared at the back of their head, hearing my own heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. Then very slowly, the figure began to turn around. They didn't move their feet. Their body just twisted mechanically. I held my breath, bracing myself to see their face. They turned completely around to face me, but there was no face. Where their eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth, pale skin stretched tightly over a skull. No features whatsoever, just a blank, empty canvas of flesh. It wasn't a mask. I could see the subtle variations in skin tone, the faint blue veins running beneath the surface of the smooth flesh. The skin looked slightly damp under the harsh light. My mind rejected the image completely. I stood paralyzed, staring into the blank space where their eyes should be. I felt like they were staring right back at me, intently. A strange, wet sound came from the figure, like tearing paper. The blank skin on the lower half of their face began to stretch and ripple. They took a single, slow step toward me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to run, but terror had locked my muscles in place. That broke my paralysis. A sound escaped my throat. I didn't think, I just reacted. I spun around and threw myself blindly at the escalator. I jumped over the metal divider and landed hard on the stationary down escalator. My knee slammed against the metal edge, but I ignored the pain. I started running down the steps, taking them 3 at a time. I didn't look back, I just ran. The descent seemed much shorter than the ride up. Within seconds, I hit the bottom and was sprinting across the main atrium. The mall looked normal again. The emergency lights, mannequins, everything was exactly as I had left it. I ran through the corridors, practically throwing myself through the exit doors and out into the night. The freezing air hit my lungs like icy glass. I sprinted across the parking lot to my car. I unlocked the door, threw myself inside, and locked it instantly. I started the engine, threw it into reverse, and peeled out of the lot. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I quit my job the very next day. I never went back to that mall. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination caused by sleep deprivation. The human brain can create terrible things when it's pushed to the absolute limit of exhaustion, but I know what I saw. And the worst part is sometimes late at night, sitting alone in my new apartment, I hear something that makes my blood run cold. It's a soft, rhythmic tapping on my living room window. Tap, tap, tap. Exactly like the sound on my car window that night, but I live on the 4th floor now, and there is no balcony outside. Story 15. During the Mountain Road passenger incident, I was staying in a basement apartment. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. My name is Caleb. I am 24 years old. I lived in a loud city and desperately needed a break. I rented the lower level of a rustic cabin tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was exactly what I thought I wanted. The property was located miles away from any main highway, accessible only by steep, winding dirt roads. The cabin itself was massive, built of dark wood and stone. The owner lived on the main floor, but when I arrived, he told me he was leaving for the weekend. I had the entire property completely to myself. I remember feeling a wave of relief. The basement apartment was cozy, but it had a slightly uncomfortable atmosphere. The ceilings were low and the air always felt damp. The only windows were small, rectangular panes that sat right at ground level. Looking out, you only saw dead leaves and tree trunks. During the day, it was incredibly peaceful. But when the sun went down, the woods outside became pitch black. There were no streetlights or ambient glow, just a thick, heavy darkness pressing against the glass. It was my second night there. The time was just past 11:30 p.m. I had spent the evening sitting on a lumpy couch trying to read. A strange sense of restlessness had started to creep over me. Being completely alone in a house that big feels weird. The silence is deafening. Every time the wind blew outside, the sound echoed in the empty rooms above me. I realized I was getting severe cabin fever. I figured a short drive would help clear my head. I grabbed my car keys, threw on a heavy winter jacket, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The woods were unnervingly quiet. I walked to my car parked on the gravel, got in and cranked the heater. I backed out of the long driveway, my headlights sweeping across the dense line of trees. I turned onto the main mountain road. It was a narrow, twisting stretch of old asphalt that hugged the side of the mountain. On my left was a rock wall, and on my right, a terrifying drop-off swallowed by absolute darkness. There were no guardrails. The only thing guiding me was the faded yellow line in the center and my bright headlights cutting through the blackness ahead. For the first 20 minutes, the drive was actually very relaxing. The hum of the tires and warm air started to soothe my nerves. I found a faint radio signal playing a low, classical melody. The volume was low, blending with the engine. I leaned back, keeping my eyes locked on the endless curves. That was when the first strange thing happened. I was coming around a particularly sharp bend when I felt a sudden, distinct shift in the air pressure inside the car. It felt like the way your ears pop when you roll down a window at high speeds, only all my windows were tightly rolled up. A second later, I heard a very faint sound coming from the back seat. It sounded like a heavy winter coat rubbing against leather. My heart did a tiny, nervous flutter, but I forced myself to brush it off. It was an old car. The suspension was probably just creaking. Maybe something I left in the back had shifted. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and kept my eyes glued to the road. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the unease did not fade. Instead, it evolved into a heavy, suffocating pressure. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. We all know that primal instinct. I could feel a gaze burning into the back of my head. Every muscle in my body suddenly tensed up. My breathing became shallow. Slowly, almost against my own will, I shifted my gaze up to the rearview mirror. It was completely dark back there. The weak glow from the dashboard only illuminated the empty passenger seat next to me. I squinted, trying to pierce the shadows, but I couldn't see anything, just the dark, empty shapes of the headrests. I let out a shaky breath and forced my eyes back to the road. I continued driving for another mile before the temperature inside suddenly dropped. The warm air blowing from the heater seemed to turn ice cold in an instant. I reached over to check the dial. It was still set to maximum heat, but the air filling the cabin was freezing. My breath actually started to form tiny white clouds in front of me, and then I heard the sound again. It was much louder this time. It was the distinct sound of someone shifting their weight on the back seat. I heard the leather creak loudly under a heavy mass. At the exact same moment, the rear suspension of the car groaned slightly. A jolt of pure, paralyzing terror shot straight through my chest. The rational part of my brain completely shut down. I knew with absolute certainty that I was not alone in the car. I was terrified. I wanted to slam on the brakes and run into the woods. But I was on a pitch-black mountain road with a deadly drop-off right next to me. I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror one more time. As my car passed beneath the overhanging branches of a massive pine tree, a sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness. In that split second, I saw it. Sitting directly behind me was a figure. I couldn't make out any facial features, but I saw the pale outline of a head and shoulders. It was sitting perfectly still, leaning slightly forward, listening to my breathing. A scream caught in my throat. I yanked my eyes away from the mirror, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared blindly at the road ahead. I needed to look again. Gathering every ounce of courage, I darted my eyes back to the mirror. The back seat was completely empty. There was no pale face, just the dark leather. I let out a gasp of air, a confusing mix of relief and complete disbelief washing over me. I started to slow the car down, trying to catch my breath. I told myself I was fine. Everything was fine, and then the most terrifying sound I have ever heard echoed through the small cabin. Right behind my left ear, just inches away from my head, I heard the unmistakable mechanical click of the rear passenger door unlocking. My car had manual locks. They didn't unlock automatically. Something had just physically pulled the lock up on the door right behind me. A wave of cold dread washed over my entire body. I didn't look in the mirror again. I slammed the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, engine roaring as I accelerated dangerously down the mountain road. The drive back felt like an eternity. Every second I anticipated a pair of hands reaching from the back seat to grab my throat. When I finally saw the dirt driveway leading up to the rental property, I didn't even slow down. I tore up the gravel path, the tires spitting rocks everywhere. I slammed the brakes and threw the car into park near the basement door. I didn't bother turning off the engine. I ripped my door open, scrambled out into the freezing air, and sprinted toward the entrance. I fumbled frantically with my keys in the dark before finally getting the door unlocked. I practically threw myself inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind me. I twisted the deadbolt until it clicked loudly. I stood in the entryway, panting heavily, my legs shaking so violently I could barely stand. I backed away from the door, moving into the center of the living room. I felt safe just for a moment. I was behind a locked door. I walked over to the small couch and collapsed onto it, trying to process what had just happened. I tried to convince myself there was some logical explanation for the sound of the lock clicking. I sat there in the silence, my breathing slowly returning to normal. That is when I heard the noises upstairs. At first, it sounded like heavy footsteps packing back and forth across the hardwood floors of the main level. I felt a brief wave of relief. The owner must have come back early. I wasn't completely alone out here after all. I stood up, thinking about going upstairs, but then I stopped dead in my tracks. I remembered clearly what the owner had told me. He wasn't supposed to be back until Monday morning. The upstairs level was completely dark. There was absolutely no way he was up there. The footsteps above me continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the ceiling to the other. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, listening closely. As I focused on the sound, my blood ran completely cold. The packing wasn't coming from the ceiling above me. The acoustic was completely wrong for an indoor sound. I slowly turned my head toward the small basement window that sat at ground level. The footsteps weren't upstairs. They were right outside on the loose gravel, slowly packing back and forth around my idling car. I could hear the rocks crunching under the weight of something heavy. I backed into the darkest corner of the room, terrified to make even a single sound. I just watched that small window, praying a pale face wouldn't appear in the glass. The heavy crunching footsteps continued for hours, never moving away from the vehicle until the sun finally came up. I packed my things and left immediately, barely looking at the driveway. I still do not know what was sitting in my back seat that night, but whatever it was, it followed me home.